My name is Interrogator Matthias Crowe. Rank, Senior Investigator, Ordo Malleus. Service record, 43 years, unblemished. Commendations, 17. Heretics interrogated, 412. Heretics executed, 412. I tell you this not from pride, but from necessity. You must understand what I was before you can comprehend what I have become, or what I am becoming, or what I may have always been beneath the certainty. I believed, you see. I believed with the absolute conviction that only the Imperium can forge in a human soul. I believed in the God Emperor, blessed be his name, enthroned in golden suffering for 10,000 years. I believed in the necessity of the Inquisition, in the purity of purpose, in the righteousness of our eternal crusade against the darkness. I believed that chaos was the enemy, that the ruinous powers were corruption made manifest, that those who fell to their whispers were weak, corrupted, damned beyond redemption. I believed these things the way I believed in gravity, in the void between stars, in the beating of my own heart. I was wrong about so many things. Or perhaps I was right, and that is worse. I no longer possess the certainty to distinguish between the two, and this confession exists in that terrible space between understanding and horror, where truth becomes indistinguishable from damnation. It began, as these things often do, with a routine investigation. Hive Primus on Valkenburg Prime, a forge world of middling importance on the outer edge of the segmentum tempestus. Reports had surfaced of a cult operating in the Underhive. The usual symptoms: disappearances, strange markings, workers failing to report to their shifts. The Adeptus Arbites had conducted preliminary sweeps and discovered shrines, offerings, the scattered evidence of unsanctioned worship. They requested Inquisitorial support when 3 of their enforcers vanished during a raid on a suspected cult gathering. I arrived with my retinue, 6 acolytes, 4 stormtroopers, 1 sanctioned psyker. Standard complement for cult suppression. We descended into the Underhive with flommers loaded, faith renewed through prayer and ritual cleansing. I expected resistance. I expected heresy. I expected the familiar patterns of chaos corruption that I had witnessed and purged dozens of times before. The makeshift altars, the crude 8-pointed stars, the madness and violence that accompanies those who traffic with the warp. What I found instead was order. The cult shrine, when we finally breached it, was not the charnel house I anticipated. It was clean, organized. The walls bore elaborate frescoes, not painted in blood but in careful, precise pigments depicting scenes I recognized from forbidden texts. The primordial truth, they called it in some of those heretical manuscripts. The transformation of the faithful into something greater, something beyond the limitations of flesh, beyond the narrow definitions of humanity that the Imperium enforces with such brutal consistency. There were no bodies, no evidence of sacrifice. The cultists, perhaps 200 souls, knelt in perfect rows before an altar that held no demon thing, no warp-spawned abomination, but rather a simple book, unadorned, leather-bound, old beyond reckoning. They did not resist when we entered. They did not flee. They simply continued their prayer, a low murmuring chant in a language that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. My psyker, Callista, collapsed immediately, blood streaming from her nose, her augmetic eyes sparking as she convulsed. The chant was psychoactive, mimetically weaponized, designed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to something deeper, something older than cognition. Burn them, I ordered. Standard protocol. Purge and cleanse. Leave nothing but ash in the Emperor's judgment. My acolytes raised their flommers. The cultists continued their prayer, and the eldest among them, a woman whose face bore the scars of a long life in the Underhive, looked directly at me with eyes that held no fear, no madness, only a terrible, patient understanding. "You cannot burn what we have become, Interrogator," she said, her voice cutting through the chant with unnatural clarity. "You can only delay your own comprehension, but you will understand. You have already begun." I ordered the purge. I watched them burn. I inhaled the smoke of their immolation and felt nothing but satisfaction at another heresy cleansed, another threat to the Imperium eliminated. We recovered the book, sealed it in a stasis container, and prepared it for transport to the nearest Inquisitorial fortress for analysis and eventual destruction. It was standard procedure. It was righteous work. It was, I believed then, another victory in the endless war against chaos. But that night, as we prepared to depart Valkenburg Prime, I found myself thinking about the woman's words, not with concern, but with the academic curiosity that had served me well throughout my career. What had she meant? What delusion had chaos planted in her mind that allowed her to face immolation with such calm certainty? I requested permission to review the recovered texts before their destruction. My superiors granted it. Why wouldn't they? I was experienced, disciplined, faithful. I had reviewed countless heretical materials without corruption. I was a tool of the Inquisition, sharpened through decades of service, incapable of being swayed by the lies of the ruinous powers. I believe that too. The book was written in High Gothic, surprisingly. No demonic script, no reality-bending glyphs. Just words, carefully arranged, describing a process. The author called himself Brother Silenus, a former apothecary of the Word-Bearers, writing in the years immediately following the Horus heresy. He had witnessed, he claimed, the truth behind the Imperial cult's greatest fear, the transformation of the faithful into chaos spawn. I had seen spawn before. Every servant of the Inquisition has. They are wretched things, the ultimate punishment for those who embrace chaos too eagerly, too completely. The ruinous powers grant their champions gifts, mutations, power, the ability to reshape flesh according to will, but those who accept too many blessings, too quickly, lose themselves entirely. Their bodies collapse into writhing masses of incompatible alterations, their minds dissolving into instinct and hunger. They become spawn, mindless, violent, pitiful creatures that even the forces of chaos regard with contempt. The Imperium teaches that this is chaos's true nature, corruption without purpose, degradation disguised as ascension, the inevitable fate of all who reject the Emperor's light. Brother Silenus proposed something different, something worse. He suggested that the transformation into spawn was not punishment, but transcendence, not degradation, but evolution beyond the limitations of singular consciousness. He described the process in clinical terms, as an apothecary would, detailing the neurological changes, the dissolution of ego boundaries, the expansion of sensory perception beyond what baseline human neurology could process. The mutations were not random, he argued, but responsive, the body attempting to manifest all possible forms simultaneously, experiencing every potential iteration of self at once. The madness was not madness at all, but the overwhelming experience of infinite perspective. The violence was not mindless, but the simple inability to communicate needs and intentions through any framework comprehensible to those still trapped in singular identity. To become spawn, he wrote, is to become everything you could have been, are, and will be, collapsed into a single moment of infinite becoming. The pain is temporary. The understanding is eternal. Those who achieve this state are not lost. They have simply moved beyond our capacity to recognize them as kin. I read this and felt disgust. Heresy of the most transparent kind. An attempt to rationalize the inevitable consequences of chaos worship. To transform degradation into virtue through rhetorical manipulation. I had encountered similar arguments before from cultists desperate to justify their damnation. But Brother Silenus included testimonies, dozens of them, recorded through vox capture from individuals in the early stages of spawn transformation, before their vocal structures mutated beyond the capacity for human speech. They described sensations, experiences, perceptions that defied summary but which shared common elements. The dissolution of the self not as loss but as expansion, the mutations not as invasion but as revelation, the final moments before complete transformation as approaching something vast and welcoming and utterly beyond human comprehension. I can feel the boundaries dissolving. One account read, transcribed from the changing throat of a former Imperial guardsman. I thought I was dying. I thought I was losing myself. But I'm not disappearing, I'm multiplying. I can feel every version of myself that could have existed, every choice I could have made, every life I might have lived. They're all real. They're all here. They're all me. And I am becoming the space where they meet. Don't more me. Don't pity me. I am more now than I ever was. I am becoming. The recording ended there, degrading into sounds that defied transcription. I should have closed the book. I should have ordered its immediate destruction and subjected myself to standard cleansing protocols. Prayer, flagellation, chemical purgation to ensure no mimetic contamination. This is procedure. This is protection. This is how the Inquisition has survived 10,000 years of war against forces that can corrupt with the single whispered word. Instead, I continued reading. Not from corruption, I told myself, but from thoroughness. To properly refute heresy, one must understand it completely. To defeat the enemy, one must map the territory of their delusions. This is what I told myself as I read through the night. As the words accumulated in my mind like snowfall, each one insignificant, their collective weight becoming impossible to ignore. Brother Salinas described the process of transformation in stages. The first, the moment of opening, when the faithful accept that change is not only possible but necessary, that the human form as defined by the Imperium is not sacred but constrained, not natural but designed to serve systems of control. The second, the initial mutations, typically small, an extra joint in a finger, a shift in bone density, eyes that begin to perceive wavelengths beyond standard human vision. The third, the acceleration, when the body begins to respond to possibility rather than limitation, when flesh becomes clay and consciousness becomes multiplied across numerous centers of awareness. The fourth stage, he claimed, was the critical threshold. This was where most transformations stalled, where the individual either achieved full spawn metamorphosis or remained trapped in a liminal state of partial change. The determining factor, according to Salinas, was not physical but philosophical, whether the transforming individual could release their attachment to singular identity, could accept that the self they had been was not being destroyed, but multiplied, expanded, distributed across forms that defied simple description. Those who resisted this release remained partially transformed, caught between states, experiencing the agony of change without its completion. Those who accepted it moved beyond pain, beyond fear, beyond all the limitations that define existence as the Imperium conceives it. The spawn are not the fallen, Salinas concluded. They are the ascended. They have achieved what the Imperium fears most: freedom from the tyranny of singular form, singular purpose, singular loyalty. They have become the living embodiment of infinite potential, and the Imperium burns them not because they are dangerous, but because they are proof that another way is possible, that humanity need not be constrained to the narrow definition the Emperor's vision imposes. I closed the book as dawn light filtered through the viewport of my quarters. I felt nothing but cold certainty that I had encountered sophisticated heresy, the kind that wraps lies in enough truth to make them appealing to those who have grown weary of faith. I would document it, recommend its destruction, and move forward with my work. But I could not stop thinking about the woman in the underhive, the calm in her eyes as she faced the flommers, the absolute conviction in her voice when she told me I had already begun to understand. What had she meant? What had I already begun? 3 weeks passed before I received new orders. 3 weeks during which I conducted standard interrogations, reviewed case files, maintained the routines of faith and service that had structured my life for 4 decades. I performed my duties with precision. I observed the rituals. I prayed at the appointed hours, reciting the catechisms I had memorized as a child in the Schola Progenium. Nothing had changed in my external behavior, and yet I found myself returning, again and again, to Brother Salinas's text, not the book itself, that remained sealed in the vault, awaiting destruction, but to the memory of its words. They had taken root in my mind with uncomfortable permanence, sprouting at odd moments, during interrogations, during prayer, during the long silences of transit through the warp. I found myself examining the heretics I questioned with new attention, looking not just for evidence of corruption, but for signs of transformation, for indications that They had begun the process Salinas described. Most showed nothing. They were simply lost souls who had traded one tyranny for another, who had exchanged the Emperor's doctrine for the empty promises of the dark gods. They deserved the purging they received. Their deaths troubled me no more than ever before. But there were others, a handful, perhaps 1 in 50. They faced execution with the same serene acceptance I had witnessed in the underhive of Arkenberg Prime. They spoke of understanding, of seeing beyond, of becoming more than what the Imperium allowed. When I pressed them for specifics, they could not articulate what they meant, or perhaps I lacked the framework to comprehend their explanations. Their words slipped around meaning, suggesting experiences that language could not properly contain. I began to document these cases separately, building a private archive I did not report to my superiors. This was technically a violation of protocol, but I rationalized it as research, as the gathering of intelligence that might prove useful for future cult suppression. The Inquisition values thoroughness. Initiative is rewarded when it serves the Emperor's purpose. I was not concealing evidence. I was organizing it more effectively. This is what I told myself. This is what I believed, even as some deeper part of my mind recognized the lie. The new orders, when they arrived, seemed almost purposefully designed to test my nascent doubts. A cult had been discovered on Sanctus Ferro, a shrine world in the Gothic sector, operating within the very precincts of the cathedral itself. The ecclesiarchy had attempted to handle the matter internally, but had been forced to request inquisitorial intervention when 3 priests vanished while investigating the cult's activities. The local cardinal suspected chaos corruption of the most insidious kind, heresy growing in the heart of faith itself, like rotten sacred timber. I accepted the assignment without hesitation. Shrine worlds were particularly vulnerable to certain forms of corruption precisely because of the intensity of faith present. The devotion that makes these worlds holy also makes them targets for those forces that feed on worship, that twist prayer into invitation, that transform adoration into doorways for things that should never be invited into reality. The Cathedral of Sanctus Ferro was a structure of impossible scale, built over thousands of years by millions of faithful hands. Its spires reached toward the sky like fingers grasping for the Emperor's throne, its walls carved with the faces of 10,000 saints and martyrs. I had visited shrine worlds before, but Sanctus Ferro was particularly orthodox, particularly pure in its devotion. If chaos had taken root here, the corruption would need to be cut out with exceptional care to avoid damaging the faith of billions. The cardinal who met me at the starport was a woman named Esmeralda Vaz, aged perhaps 70 standard years, with augmetic eyes that glowed with soft amber light. She wore her authority with practiced ease, the robes of her office tailored to suggest both humility and power. She did not waste time with pleasantries. The corruption began 6 months ago, she told me as we traveled by ground car through the pilgrim-crowded streets. Small things at first. Prayers spoken incorrectly. Ritual variations. Nothing that would concern us normally. Individual faith expresses itself in individual ways, and the Emperor hears all sincere devotion. But then we began finding the markings. She activated a data slate, displaying pic captures of cathedral walls. The carvings there were subtle, easily mistaken for decorative elements if one did not know what to look for. But I knew. The patterns were familiar from dozens of previous investigations, the geometries that chaos uses to mark its territory, to signal to the faithful that they are not alone, that others have walked this path before them. Where exactly were these found? I asked. The undercrypts, Voss replied, the oldest sections of the cathedral, built during the founding 5,000 years ago. They're used primarily for storage now, old reliquaries, archived texts, the accumulated debris of millennia of worship. Only a few priests have regular access, and those we've already interrogated. They saw nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing, and yet the markings continue to appear, fresh ones discovered every few days despite increased patrols and surveillance. The missing priests, I said. Tell me about them. Vasa's augmetic eyes dimmed slightly, a gesture that might have been grief or merely energy conservation. Father Matthias was a scholar, an expert in pre-heresy liturgical texts, Sister Delacroix taught in the Schola, training the next generation of priests. Brother Kalen was a confessor, hearing the sins of pilgrims. All three were devout beyond question, their faith tested and proven over decades of service. They volunteered to investigate the crypts together. They descended into the darkness with luminators and voxcasters and faith absolute, and they did not return. You searched for them? Extensively. We sent teams of armed priests, ecclesiarchy militants, even hired mercenaries, when our own forces reported experiencing difficulties in the deeper sections. Vox communication becomes unreliable past the third sublevel. Luminators fail despite fresh power cells. Those who spend too long in the depths report sensations of being watched, of hearing whispers just beyond the threshold of comprehension. We recovered no bodies, no evidence of violence, nothing to indicate what became of them. Nothing. I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Almost nothing, Voss corrected. She produced a sealed container from within her robes, opened it with care. Inside lay a piece of fabric, ragged and stained. This was Brother Kalen's vestment, found on the 5th sublevel, torn from his body by, we don't know what. There were no bloodstains, no sign of struggle. Just this, discarded like a shed skin. I examined the fabric without touching it, my augmetic eye scanning for trace evidence. The material showed no obvious damage beyond the tearing, no chemical residue, no biological contamination. But there was something else, something my scanner struggled to quantify. A subtle distortion in the fabric structure, as if the individual threads had begun to reorganize themselves into patterns that textile manufacture could never produce. I will need to examine the crypts, I said. Alone. Voss nodded, as if she had expected this. I'll provide you with access codes and schematics. But Interrogator Crowe, be careful. There's something in those depths that even faith seems unable to dispel. Something that whispers to the faithful in voices that sound almost holy, almost right, almost like the Emperor's own truth spoken through a different throat. I should have been alarmed by this description. I should have recognized it as evidence of demonic incursion, of warp entities wearing the mask of righteousness to lure the faithful into damnation. This was textbook chaos corruption, and my response should have been immediate escalation. Call for additional Inquisitorial support. Consider exterminatus if the corruption proved too deep to excise surgically. Instead, I felt curiosity, anticipation, the same sensation I had experienced reading Brother Salinas' text, the feeling of approaching something important, something that would reorganize my understanding if I could only perceive it clearly. I descended into the crypts at midnight, when the cathedral above was least populated, when only a skeleton crew of night watch priests moved through the vast echoing spaces. Cardinal Voss had offered me an escort, but I declined. Some investigations are best conducted in solitude, where the presence of others cannot contaminate observations or influence interpretations. The upper levels were as expected, dusty corridors lined with reliquaries containing the bones of saints, archived texts sealed in climate-controlled cases, the accumulated detritus of thousands of years of worship organized with obsessive precision. But as I descended deeper, past the 3rd sublevel, where Voss claimed the difficulties began, the atmosphere changed in ways my instruments struggled to measure. The temperature should have dropped. Subterranean spaces on most worlds grow colder the deeper one travels. Instead, I felt warmth against my skin, not uncomfortable but noticeable, like standing near a heat source that emitted no visible light. My illuminators continued to function, but the quality of the light they cast became strange, throwing shadows that seemed slightly disconnected from the objects that should produce them, creating an effect that was disorienting without being overtly threatening. And there were the markings. Not just the chaos geometries Cardinal Voss had shown me, but something more elaborate, more complex. They covered the walls in layers, newer carvings superimposed over older ones, creating palimpsests of meaning that my augmetic eye struggled to parse. Some I recognized from forbidden texts, the symbols of the changer of ways, the marks of transformation and mutation. But others were unfamiliar, and these were the ones that drew my attention most intensely. They were not chaos marks, exactly. Or rather, They were chaos marks that had been refined, systematized. The raw, chaotic energy that typically characterized such symbols had been organized into something approaching structure, as if whoever carved them was attempting to impose order on forces that defied order by their very nature. I documented everything with my recording equipment, speaking observations into my Vox log, maintaining the clinical detachment that had served me throughout my career. But beneath the professionalism, I felt something else, recognition, not of the specific symbols. I had never encountered them before, but of the principle they represented. The attempt to map the unmappable, to understand the incomprehensible, to impose human meaning on forces that transcended human categories. It was what I had been doing for 3 weeks, trying to organize my thoughts about Brother Salinas' text into a framework that my inquisitorial training could accommodate. The deeper I descended, the more elaborate the markings became. By the 5th sublevel, where Brother Kalen's vestment had been found, the walls were completely covered, every surface carved with interlocking patterns that seemed to shift and reconfigure when viewed from different angles. My augmetic, I registered them as static, unchanging stone, but my biological, I perceived movement, transformation, the constant rearrangement of meaning. I stood in that space for perhaps an hour, simply observing, trying to understand what I was seeing. And slowly, gradually, a pattern began to emerge. The markings were not random. They were not the mad scrawlings of those consumed by chaos. They were a diagram, a map, a representation of something vast and complex, rendered in 3-dimensional space, using the only medium available, the ancient stone of the cathedral's foundations. They were showing the stages of transformation, the path from singular identity to distributed consciousness, the process of becoming spawn, rendered not as degradation, but as elaborate, purposeful metamorphosis. This was what the missing priests had discovered. This was what they had been studying in the depths, away from the eyes of their superiors, away from the judgment of orthodox faith. They had not been corrupted by chaos. They had been researching it, attempting to understand it, approaching the ancient enemy, not with fire and fury, but with scholarly curiosity. And then they had discovered something that changed them fundamentally enough that they could not return to the surface, could not resume their previous lives, could only continue deeper into the darkness, following the path the markings described. I should have been horrified. I should have recognized this as corruption of the most insidious kind, the sort that wraps itself in intellectual curiosity and scholarly rigor while leading the faithful step by step away from the Emperor's light. I should have called for immediate purging, recommended that these entire sublevels be sealed and then destroyed, the knowledge they contained buried forever beneath tons of consecrated rubble. Instead, I followed the markings deeper. The 6th sublevel was not on Cardinal Voss's schematics. The entrance was concealed behind what appeared to be a solid wall, but which proved, upon closer examination, to be a cunningly crafted door. It seems invisible until one knew precisely where to look. The missing priests had found this place. They had opened this door, and they had not come back. I opened it again, my hand steady, my breath even, my heartbeat calm despite the enormity of what I was doing. I was violating protocol. I was placing myself at risk. I was doing exactly what countless fallen inquisitors had done before me, convincing themselves that they could safely examine the darkness, that their faith was strong enough, they were sufficient, their understanding deep enough to navigate chaos without being consumed by it. But I was not being consumed, I told myself. I was investigating. I was gathering intelligence. I was doing my duty as an interrogator of the Holy Inquisition, following evidence wherever it led, no matter how uncomfortable the destination. The space beyond the hidden door was vast, much larger than the cramped corridors I had traversed to reach it. It had been carved from the living rock beneath the cathedral, a chamber perhaps 200 meters across and 30 meters high, its surfaces covered completely in the elaborate markings I had been following. But these were not mere carvings. They had been painted as well, colored with pigments that glowed with soft bioluminescence, creating an effect that was simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling. In the center of the chamber stood a structure that might have been an altar or might have been something else entirely. It was organic in form, grown rather than built, its surface rippling with textures that suggested flesh, chitin, metal, and crystal all at once, shifting between states without settling into any single configuration. And upon this structure lay three figures. I recognized them even before I approached. The missing priests. Father Matthias, Sister Delacroix, Brother Kalen. They were alive. Their chests rose and fell with breath. Their eyes moved beneath closed lids as if dreaming. But they had changed. Their skin showed the early signs of mutation. Extra joints, shifted bone structure, surfaces that seemed to flow and reconfigure as I watched. They were in transition, caught in the early stages of the transformation Brother Salinas had described. They were becoming spawn, and they were doing it deliberately, systematically, with full knowledge of what they were undertaking. This was not corruption forced upon them by demonic incursion. This was chosen transformation, researched and prepared for, undertaken with the same careful planning a scholar might apply to any difficult and dangerous study. I stood in that chamber for a time I cannot measure. Minutes, hours. The chronometer on my wrist had stopped functioning, its display frozen at the moment I passed through the hidden door. I studied the priests, studied the markings on the walls, studied the altar structure that supported them, trying to understand what I was witnessing, trying to fit it into any framework my training provided. And then one of them opened their eyes. Sister Delacroix. Her eyes had changed. The pupils no longer round, but fractured into geometric patterns, reflecting light in ways that human eyes should not. She looked at me with those impossible eyes, and she smiled with a mouth that was still mostly human, though I could see the beginning of changes in the structure of her jaw, the arrangement of her teeth. "Interrogator Crowe," she said, her voice layered with harmonics that human vocal cords could not produce. "We wondered if you would find us. If you would be brave enough to follow the markings all the way down. Welcome. Welcome to the truth beneath the faith. Welcome to the understanding the Imperium cannot tolerate. Welcome to the beginning of your own transformation." I raised my bolt pistol, aimed it at her head with the trained reflex of 4 decades of service. "You are corrupted," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "You have fallen to chaos. You will be purged, and this place will be sealed forever." She did not show fear. She showed pity. "We have not fallen, Matthias. We have risen. We have begun the journey that all humanity should be free to undertake. If only the Imperium did not murder us for seeking transcendence. Look at the walls. Read what we have written. Understand what we have discovered. The spawn are not the corrupted. They are the liberated. And you, whether you acknowledge it or not, have already begun the same journey. Why else would you have come here alone? Why else would you have followed the markings? Why else would you have read Brother Salinas's text and found yourself unable to dismiss it as simple heresy? "I came to stop you," I said, "to purge the corruption before it spreads." "Then purge us," she replied, spreading her arms, offering herself as a target. "Pull the trigger, Matthias. Do your duty. Serve the Imperium as you have served it all your life. Kill us and seal this chamber and return to the surface and report that the heresy has been cleansed. You can do all of this. You are capable of it. But you will not be able to forget what you have seen here. You will not be able to stop thinking about the markings, about the transformation, about the question that now lives in your mind like a seed waiting to germinate. What if we are right?" My finger tightened on the trigger. I am trained for this moment. I have executed heretics who begged for their lives, who wept and pleaded and offered me everything they possessed for mercy. I have purged the innocent alongside the guilty when the corruption spread too deep to excise surgically. I have ordered exterminators on worlds where billions lived, where children played in streets, where love and hope and simple human kindness existed alongside the taint that made their continued existence too dangerous to tolerate. I should have killed her. I should have killed all 3 of them, burned the chamber, collapsed the entire sublevel, and recommended that the cathedral itself be demolished and rebuilt on purified ground. Instead, I lowered my weapon. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me everything." And Sister Delacroix, no longer entirely Sister Delacroix, no longer entirely anything that the Imperium would recognize as human, began to speak. Sister Delacroix spoke for what felt like hours, though time in that chamber had become unreliable, measured not by chronometers, but by the rhythm of transformation occurring in the bodies of the three priests. Her words came in layers, some spoken in Gothic, some in languages I half recognized from forbidden texts, some in sounds that bypassed language entirely and communicated meaning directly into my mind through mechanisms I could not identify. I should clarify what I mean by this. I was not being possessed. I was not experiencing psychic intrusion of the kind that psychers wield or that demons use to breach the barriers between materium and immaterium. What I experienced was something else entirely. Communication that occurred through channels the Imperium does not acknowledge exist, because acknowledging them would require admitting that human consciousness is not the fixed, singular thing our doctrines claim it to be. She began with history. The true history, she claimed, not the sanitized version the ecclesiarchy teaches, but the concealed record recovered from forbidden archives, from texts hidden by inquisitors who understood that some knowledge could not be destroyed without also destroying the possibility of ever understanding the enemy we fight. The Emperor, she said, understood transformation in ways that his Imperium has forgotten or deliberately suppressed. Before he ascended the Golden Throne, before the heresy, before even the Great Crusade, he experimented with human evolution, with pushing the boundaries of what baseline humanity could become. The Primarchs were the most famous products of this research, but they were not the only ones. There were others. Failed experiments, the Imperium calls them, abominations that had to be destroyed to preserve the purity of the human form. I knew some of this already. Every Inquisitor learns of the Emperor's hidden works, the experiments conducted in the laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains during Old Night, the countless attempts to create superior humans that ended in disaster. This knowledge justifies the Imperium's stance on mutation, on the necessity of genetic purity, on the absolute prohibition against allowing humanity to evolve beyond the narrow parameters the Emperor established. But what if the failures were not failures at all? Delacroix continued, her transforming eyes reflecting the bioluminescent markings with unsettling beauty. What if they were successes that terrified him, because they represented forms of human existence that could not be controlled, could not be organized into armies, could not be made to serve his vision of galactic conquest? What if the Emperor destroyed his own greatest achievements because they threatened the totalitarian structure he was building? Heresy, I said, but the word lacked conviction. I was listening. I was considering. I was doing exactly what she intended, allowing her words to take root in the carefully maintained garden of my faith. Is it heresy to question? She asked. Is it heresy to examine the evidence and reach conclusions that differ from official doctrine? Or is heresy simply whatever threatens the Imperium's power, whatever suggests that humanity might have options beyond eternal servitude to a corpse god who has not spoken in 10,000 years? I should have executed her then. Calling the Emperor a corpse god was blasphemy of the highest order, punishable by the most prolonged and agonizing death the Inquisition could devise. But I did not pull the trigger. I wanted to hear more. I needed to understand the shape of her delusion before I could properly refute it. This is what I told myself. This is the lie I used to justify my continued listening. The Chaos Gods, Delacroix continued, are not what the Imperium claims. They are not purely evil, not merely destructive, not simple enemies to be defeated through faith and firepower. They are forces of transformation, engines of change, representations of possibilities that the Materium cannot ordinarily access. They offer humanity what the Emperor denied us, the freedom to evolve, to transform, to become something other than what we are. They offer corruption, I countered, degradation, the dissolution of self, the loss of humanity, the transformation into mindless spawn or demonic puppets. I have seen what chaos does to those who embrace it. Have you, she asked, or have you seen what the Imperium claims chaos does, filtered through 10,000 years of propaganda designed to make you fear the one force that could free you from servitude? Look at me, Matthias. Look at us. Do we appear mindless? Do we seem degraded? We chose this transformation. We researched it carefully, prepared ourselves spiritually and physically, and we are undertaking it with full awareness of every stage. We are not victims of chaos. We are students of transformation, scholars of metamorphosis, explorers of possibilities that the Imperium murders people for even contemplating. I looked at her. I looked at the other two priests, still sleeping or meditating or undergoing whatever process occupied them during their transformation. They did not appear to be suffering. Their mutations, while unsettling to observe, did not seem random or chaotic. There was pattern to them, purpose, as if their bodies were being carefully resculpted according to some template I could not perceive. Brother Salinas' text, I said. You've read it. We've done more than read it, Delacroix replied. We verified it. For 6 months, we descended into these crypts and studied everything the Imperium tried to hide. Text sealed by order of the Inquisition. Recordings recovered from chaos cultists before their execution. Testimonies from individuals in the early stages of transformation, preserved by inquisitors who understood that knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, has value. And we found something the Imperium fears above all else: consistency. Explain, I said, lowering my bolt pistol, but not holstering it. A compromise between curiosity and caution. The testimonies, she said, from dozens of different sources, different worlds, different time periods, different chaos cults with no connection to one another. They all describe the same experience, the same stages of transformation, the same sensations, the same perceptions, the same understanding. This should be impossible if spawn transformation is truly random corruption, if it's merely the inevitable result of accepting too many mutations without coherent purpose. Randomness does not produce identical patterns across unconnected populations. Randomness does not generate consistent testimonies from subjects who have never communicated with each other. I felt something shift in my understanding, a foundation stone coming loose. She was right. I had interrogated enough chaos cultists to know that their testimonies varied wildly in details, that corruption took infinite forms depending on which god they served, what mutations they accepted, how deeply they embraced the warp. No two cases were identical, except the spawn testimonies. Those did show consistency. I had noticed this in my own secret documentation, but had attributed it to coincidence, to the human brain's tendency to impose pattern on chaos, to misinterpretation of data that defied proper analysis. But what if it was not coincidence? What if the consistency indicated something real, something systematic, something that the Imperium had classified as corruption precisely because it threatened the fundamental narrative that justified 10,000 years of totalitarian control? We found other records too, Delacroix continued. Sealed documents from the Horus Heresy itself, from the early days when the Imperium was still learning what chaos could do, before the propaganda hardened into absolute doctrine. There were inquisitors in those earliest days who studied transformation rather than simply purging it, who recognized that humanity was being offered something profound, something that might be terrible but might also be transcendent. These inquisitors were themselves purged, of course. Their research was seized and buried, but fragments survived, hidden in archives like this one, waiting for those with courage enough to seek truth regardless of consequences. She gestured to the walls, to the elaborate markings that covered every surface. This is their legacy, the accumulated knowledge of centuries of hidden research compiled by faithful servants of the Imperium who recognized that loyalty to humanity might require disloyalty to the Imperium's official narrative. They documented the stages of transformation. They recorded the testimonies of the changing. They preserved the understanding that the Imperium tried to erase, that spawn are not corrupted but completed, not lost but found, not degraded but elevated to a state of existence that transcends the limitations the Emperor imposed on baseline humanity. Why? I asked. Why would the Emperor limit humanity if transformation offered such transcendence? Why would he build an entire civilization devoted to preventing this evolution if it represents genuine advancement? Control, Delacroix said simply. An empire of transformed humans, of beings who experienced reality through multiple perspectives simultaneously, who possessed consciousness distributed across forms that defied simple categorization. Such beings could not be organized into armies, could not be commanded through simple hierarchy, could not be made to die in pointless wars for the glory of a singular vision. The Emperor needed soldiers, not philosophers, warriors, not explorers of consciousness, servants, not free beings. So he lied, I said slowly. He called transformation corruption to prevent humanity from evolving beyond his control. We believe so, Delacroix replied, though perhaps lied is too simple. Perhaps he genuinely believed that his vision for humanity, organized, regimented, unified under singular purpose, was superior to the chaotic multiplicity that transformation represents. Perhaps he thought he was protecting us from dangers we could not comprehend. But the result is the same. Humanity has been locked into a single form, a single mode of consciousness, for 10,000 years. We have been told that this is natural, that this is sacred, that this is the only way to be properly human, and anyone who discovers otherwise is burned as a heretic. I stood in that chamber, my bolt pistol hanging loose in my hand, my faith, the foundation upon which I had built 4 decades of service, cracking like ice under pressure. Everything she said was heresy of the most fundamental kind, but it was also logically consistent, supported by evidence, and explained phenomena I had observed but never properly questioned. The 3 of you, I said, you decided to undergo this transformation yourselves, to test the theory. We did, she confirmed. We prepared for months, studying the texts, performing the rituals, creating the conditions necessary for controlled metamorphosis. We are not surrendering to chaos. We are engaging with it scientifically, treating it as a force to be understood rather than merely feared. And we are discovering that everything we were taught is either incomplete or deliberately misleading. What have you discovered? I asked, and I was horrified to realize that I genuinely wanted to know, that my question was not interrogatory technique, but sincere curiosity. That transformation is not loss, but multiplication, she said. That the self does not dissolve but expands, distributes, experiences existence through perspectives that singular consciousness cannot access. That the mutations are not random but responsive, the body attempting to manifest all its potential forms simultaneously. That the madness is temporary, a transition period while consciousness adjusts to processing vastly more information than human neurology was designed to handle. And that on the other side of transformation, if one can maintain coherence through the transition, lies a state of being that is extraordinary. You haven't completed the transformation yet, I observed. How do you know what lies on the other side? We dream it, said a new voice. Father Mathis had opened his eyes, though I had not noticed him stirring. His face had changed significantly, the bone structure shifting to accommodate additional sensory organs that were still forming beneath translucent skin. Every night, we dream the completion. We experience what we will become, and then we wake, still mostly human, still trapped in singular consciousness, and the memory of that multiplicity is almost unbearable in its beauty. Show me, I said, and I did not recognize my own voice speaking these words, did not recognize the person I was becoming, standing in that forbidden chamber, asking heretics to demonstrate their corruption rather than purging them as doctrine demanded. Father Mathis smiled with a mouth that was no longer entirely symmetrical, teeth having shifted and multiplied to accommodate new functions. We cannot show you what we experience. Human language is inadequate, human perception too limited, but we can show you the testimonies, the preserved recordings from others who have walked this path before us. Perhaps you will hear in their words what we hear, not madness but meaning, not corruption but communication from a state of being that the Imperium pretends does not exist. He gestured, and the bioluminescent markings on the walls shifted, reconfigured themselves, revealed alcoves I had not noticed before. These contained data slates, hundreds of them, carefully archived and organized. The hidden research of forbidden inquisitors, preserved across centuries, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough or foolish enough to seek them out. I spent the next several hours, though again, time had become unreliable, reviewing these files. Testimonies from individuals undergoing transformation, recorded by inquisitors who should have been purging them, but who instead chose to document what they witnessed. The subjects described experiences that were remarkably consistent across time periods, across worlds, across different chaos cults, and different paths of transformation. They spoke of boundaries dissolving between self and other, between past and future, between was and could be. They described perceiving reality through multiple sensory frameworks simultaneously, experiencing the world as color and sound and pressure and quantum probability all at once. They reported memories that could not be their own, but which felt more real than their personal histories, as if transformation granted access to collective human experience accumulated across millennia. And they all, every single one, described the moment of completion, the final transformation into full spawn, as a release, a liberation, a coming home to something vast and welcoming that had been waiting for them all along. These could be fabrications, I said, though I did not believe it even as I spoke. Chaos-influenced illusions, hallucinations caused by warp exposure, the dying fantasies of minds dissolving into madness. They could be, Brother Kalen agreed. He had woken as well, his voice harmonizing with itself in ways that suggested multiple vocal cords operating in coordination. But consider this, Interrogator. Why would chaos bother to fabricate consistent testimony? The ruinous powers could promise anything. Infinite power, eternal life, revenge against enemies, the fulfillment of any desire. Why would they consistently offer the same specific experience to individuals who have no contact with each other? Why would the lie remain so stable across time and space? Unless it's not a lie, I said quietly. Unless this is what actually happens during transformation, and the Imperium has spent 10,000 years suppressing the truth because acknowledging it would undermine everything the Emperor built. Now you begin to understand, Sister Delacroix said. Now you approach the realization that we reached 6 months ago, the understanding that changed everything for us. The Imperium is not protecting humanity from chaos. The Imperium is protecting itself from humanity's potential. And we, the faithful, the devoted, the true believers, we are complicit in our own imprisonment because we have been taught to fear the very thing that could free us. I should note here, for whoever finds this testimony, that I was not corrupted at this point. I had not accepted chaos. I had not undergone any ritual, any mutation, any physical transformation. I was simply listening, considering, weighing evidence against doctrine, as I had been trained to do throughout my career in the Inquisition. I was performing my duty, investigating thoroughly, gathering all available information before reaching conclusions. This is what I told myself. But some part of me, growing stronger with each passing moment, recognized that this too was a lie. I had crossed the threshold the moment I descended into these crypts alone, the moment I opened the hidden door, the moment I lowered my weapon and asked them to explain rather than immediately executing them as heretics. I had begun my own transformation, though I did not yet understand what form it would take. What happens now? I asked. You three continue your metamorphosis here in secret until it's complete. Then what? You emerge as spawn and what? Live in these crypts forever? Try to explain your transformation to the Cardinal, to the Ecclesiarchy, to the trillions of faithful who have been taught that what you've become is the ultimate corruption. We don't know, Father Mathis admitted. We haven't thought that far ahead. Our focus has been on achieving the transformation itself, on proving that it's possible to do this deliberately, consciously, without surrendering to mindless chaos. If we succeed, if we maintain our coherence and our ability to communicate, then perhaps we can begin the difficult work of teaching others, of showing the Imperium that there are other paths, other possibilities, other ways to be human than the narrow definition imposed 10,000 years ago. They will kill you, I said flatly. The moment you emerge, the moment your transformation is discovered, the full might of the Imperium will descend on this place. The cathedral will be razed. The entire population of this world will be subjected to purging. Sanctus Ferro will become a monument to the Imperium's intolerance, an example of what happens when faith is questioned. Perhaps, Delacroix said, but perhaps not. Perhaps there are others like us, scattered throughout the Imperium, individuals who have reached the same conclusions independently, who are waiting for someone to speak the truth publicly. Perhaps the Imperium is more fragile than it appears, its control maintained only because no one has had the courage to challenge it openly. Perhaps we will be the spark that ignites a revolution of consciousness across the galaxy. Or perhaps you will simply be murdered and forgotten, I said. Another cult purged, another heresy suppressed, another footnote in the Inquisition's endless catalog of threats eliminated. That is also possible, she acknowledged. But we have already made our choice, Interrogator. The only question now is, what choice will you make? Will you report what you have found here and doom us to purging? Will you continue your investigation and risk discovering truths that your faith cannot accommodate? Or will you join us, undergo the transformation yourself, and experience firsthand whether what we claim is truth or simply the most elaborate delusion chaos has ever crafted? I stood in that chamber beneath the cathedral's Sanctus Ferro, surrounded by heretics who had once been faithful, by testimonies that challenged everything I believed, by evidence that suggested the Imperium might be built on a foundation of lies so vast that even contemplating them felt like standing at the edge of an abyss. And I realized that I could not simply leave, could not unsee what I had witnessed, could not unhear what they had told me, could not unknow what I now understood. I had passed the point of no return without even noticing the threshold. I was not yet transformed, not yet corrupted, not yet committed to the path the three priests had chosen. But I was no longer the interrogator who had descended into these crypts hours or days or weeks ago. That person no longer existed. I had already begun to change. And the most terrifying part was not the change itself, but the fact that I could no longer determine whether this was corruption or awakening, whether I was falling or finally beginning to rise. I emerged from the crypts 48 hours after I had entered them, though I only know this because Cardinal Voss informed me of the duration when I returned to the surface. To me, the time below had felt both infinite and instantaneous, measured not by chronometers, but by the accumulation of understanding, by the slow dismantling of certainties I had carried for 4 decades. I did not report what I had found. I told Voss that the crypts contained evidence of heretical research, but that the perpetrators had fled, likely having learned of my arrival through informants within the cathedral staff. I recommended increased security and surveillance, but did not suggest raising the sublevels or conducting wholesale purges. This was a violation of protocol severe enough to warrant my own execution if discovered, and yet I committed it with remarkable ease, the lie flowing from my lips as smoothly as truth had once done. Cardinal Voss accepted my report without obvious suspicion. Why would she doubt me? I was an interrogator of the Holy Inquisition, veteran of decades of faithful service, incorruptible by design and training. If I said the heretics had fled, then they had fled. If I recommended measured response rather than overwhelming purge, then such temperance must be warranted by circumstances she need not question. The trust placed in the Inquisition is absolute. This makes us powerful. It also makes us dangerous when that trust is betrayed. I remained on Sanctus Ferro for 3 more weeks, ostensibly continuing my investigation, establishing surveillance protocols, interviewing cathedral staff who might have had contact with the missing priests. In reality, I was returning to the crypts each night, descending through the hidden door, sitting in that chamber with Father Matthias, Sister Delacroix, and Brother Kalen as their transformation continued, progressed, accelerated toward completion. I watched them change. I documented the process with the clinical precision of an inquisitorial investigator, recording every stage of mutation, every shift in consciousness, every indication of how their experience of reality was being fundamentally altered. But I was no longer documenting evidence for eventual prosecution. I was studying, learning, preparing. Preparing for what? I did not yet know. Or rather, I knew but could not acknowledge it. could not speak it aloud even to myself, because doing so would make real a choice I was not yet ready to commit to irreversibly. The transformation did not progress uniformly. Some changes came rapidly. Additional sensory organs, shifted bone structure, skin that became translucent or chitinous or metallic by turns. Other changes occurred slowly, almost imperceptibly, visible only when comparing recordings from different days. But the most significant changes were not physical. They were cognitive, perceptual, experiential. I can remember things that never happened to me. Father Matthias told me during one of these sessions. His eyes, now numbering 6, arranged in bilateral pairs down the sides of his face, tracked movements I could not perceive, processing wavelengths beyond standard human vision, memories from other lives, other versions of myself that branched away at different choice points. I remember deciding to join the ecclesiarchy, which I did, but I also remember not joining, becoming a merchant instead, living a completely different life. Both memories feel equally real. Both versions of myself feel equally me. That's impossible, I said, though by this point I said such things more from habit than conviction. You can only have lived one life. Memory doesn't work across branching timelines. Human memory doesn't, he agreed, but I'm becoming less human with each passing day. And whatever I'm becoming has access to information that singular consciousness cannot process. It's not that I'm hallucinating alternate lives. I'm perceiving the quantum superposition of choices, the cloud of potential that collapses into singular experience only because human neurology lacks the capacity to maintain coherence across multiple states simultaneously. You're describing madness, I said. The inability to distinguish between real and imagined, between actual and potential. Or I'm describing expanded perception, he countered. The ability to perceive reality more completely than baseline humans can. You stand in a room and see only what your eyes detect in the visible spectrum. A person with augmetic eyes that detect infrared sees more of the same room, not a different room, not a hallucination, just more of what was always there. What I'm experiencing is similar, except the additional information is temporal rather than spectral. I'm seeing the full possibility space of my existence, not just the single collapsed waveform that standard consciousness perceives as my life. I understood, intellectually, what he was describing. Quantum mechanics had long suggested that reality existed in superposition until observed, that consciousness itself might play a role in collapsing probability into actuality. But this was theoretical, philosophical, applicable only at scales too small for human perception. The idea that a person could consciously experience quantum superposition at the macro scale, could perceive multiple timelines simultaneously, was what? Impossible. Or merely impossible within the constraints of baseline human consciousness. Show me, I said, not for the first time. I had been asking them to demonstrate their expanded perception for days, and they had consistently declined, claiming I would not be able to process what they showed me, that my singular consciousness would interpret their attempts at communication as gibberish or madness. But this time, Father Matthias nodded with his changed head, his multiple eyes focusing on me with unsettling coordination. Very well, but understand that what you're about to experience will be difficult. Your brain will resist it. You may experience disorientation, nausea, possibly unconsciousness. The human mind is not designed to process information in the way I'm about to present it. He reached out with a hand that was no longer entirely a hand. Fingers had multiplied and elongated. The bones restructured into something more like a starfish's radial symmetry than standard human anatomy. He placed this hand against my forehead, his skin warm and textured like leather that had been carefully tooled with elaborate patterns. And then he showed me. I cannot describe what I experienced adequately. Language fails. The words available to me were developed by and for singular consciousness, for beings who experience linear time, for minds that process information sequentially rather than simultaneously. What Father Matthias shared with me was not sequential. It was not linear. It was everything at once. I saw myself as I was in that moment, standing in the crypt, 47 years old, wearing the black coat of an Inquisitorial interrogator, bolt pistol holstered at my hip. But I also saw myself at every other moment of my life simultaneously. Childhood in the Schola Progenium, adolescence, training with the Inquisition, young adulthood, conducting my first investigations, middle age grown certain and perhaps arrogant in my faith. All of these moments were equally present, equally real, equally now. And then I saw the moments that had not occurred but could have. The version of myself who had failed the Schola entrance examinations and became a scribe instead. The version who had died during my first field operation, shot by a cultist I had not noticed in time. The version who had accepted a marriage proposal from a fellow acolyte and left the Inquisition to raise children on a quiet agri-world. Dozens of versions, hundreds, each one as real as the actual path my life had taken. Each one feeling like me, like choices I had made even though I knew I had not made them. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt like years. When Father Matthias removed his hand, I collapsed, my legs unable to support me, my mind reeling from the experience of perceiving existence from a framework my neurology was never designed to accommodate. That, he said quietly, is what we experience constantly now. Every moment contains all moments. Every choice contains all choices. We are becoming beings who exist across probability rather than within it. And the Imperium would burn us for this capability, would call it corruption and mutation and loss of humanity, when in fact it represents the expansion of human potential beyond anything the Emperor imagined. I vomited, a purely physical reaction to neurological overload, to consciousness stretched beyond its tolerances and then released to snap back into singular perspective. I vomited and gasped and felt my heart racing with something that might have been terror, or might have been exhilaration, or might have been both simultaneously. You showed me that to recruit me, I said when I could speak again, to convince me to join you, to undergo transformation myself. We showed you that because you asked, Sister Delacroix corrected. Her transformation had progressed differently than Father Matthias's. Her changes were more organic, more fluid, her form seeming to shift subtly even when still, as if her body could not settle into any single configuration. Whether you choose transformation is your decision alone. We will not coerce you. We will not manipulate you beyond offering truth, as we have experienced it. The choice must be freely made, or it is not choice at all but another form of servitude. The Imperium would say you've already corrupted me, I said, that by sharing this experience, by showing me what transformation offers, you've planted the seeds of heresy in my mind, that I'm already damned, already lost, already compromised beyond redemption. The Imperium says many things, Brother Kalen observed. His transformation was the most advanced, his original form now barely recognizable beneath layers of mutation that had accumulated like sediment, building towards some final configuration I could not predict. But the question is, do you believe them? After everything you've witnessed, after everything you've learned, after experiencing even a fraction of what we experience constantly, do you still believe that the Imperium's definitions of humanity, of purity, of proper consciousness are correct? Or do you recognize them as limitations imposed to maintain control? I sat on the cold stone floor of that hidden chamber, surrounded by 3 individuals who had been faithful servants of the Emperor and who were becoming something the Imperium would classify as monstrous abominations, requiring immediate extermination. I sat and I thought, and I examined my beliefs with the same critical rigor I had once applied to interrogating heretics, and I realized that I no longer knew what I believed. The certainty was gone. The absolute conviction that had sustained me through 4 decades of service had been eroded by evidence, by testimony, by direct experience of phenomena that should not exist according to imperial doctrine. I could no longer simply dismiss what I had witnessed as corruption or delusion. I had felt it myself, that expansion of consciousness, that glimpse of existence beyond the narrow parameters of singular perspective. It had lasted only seconds, but it had changed me fundamentally. I now knew that such perception was possible, that human consciousness was capable of experiences the Imperium claimed were only chaos-spawned madness. And knowing this, I could not unknow it. I could not return to comfortable certainty. I could not resume my previous life as if nothing had changed. I need time, I said finally. Time to think, to process, to decide what I believe now that my previous beliefs have been disrupted. Take all the time you need, Father Matthias said, but understand that time itself is limited. We will complete our transformation soon, perhaps within days. When that happens, we will no longer be able to remain hidden. Our changed forms will be obvious to anyone who sees us. The cathedral will discover what has occurred here, and the Inquisition will come. If not you personally, then others who lack your flexibility of thought. This place will be purged. The knowledge preserved here will be destroyed, and the possibility of what we represent will be buried for another generation, another century, another 1,000 years. Unless, Sister Delacroix added softly, you choose differently, unless you decide that some truths are worth preserving, even truths that the Imperium forbids. Unless you recognize that your duty is not to the Inquisition, not to the Emperor's corpse throne, but to humanity's potential, to the possibility of becoming more than what we have been allowed to be. I left the crypts that night without answering, without committing, without making the choice they were offering me. I returned to my chambers in the cathedral's guest quarters, and I sat alone in the darkness, and I contemplated what I had become. Not transformed, not yet, not physically mutated or obviously corrupted, but changed nonetheless. Changed in ways that felt as fundamental as any mutation, as permanent as any physical alteration. The Interrogator Matthias Crowe, who had arrived on Sanctus Ferro 3 weeks ago, would have purged the crypts without hesitation, would have executed the 3 priests, and burned their research, and felt nothing but satisfaction at another heresy cleansed. The person I had become could not do this, could not unknow what I now knew, could not unsee what I had witnessed, could not deny that transformation might represent something other than simple corruption. I reviewed my recordings from the crypts, the hundreds of hours of testimony and documentation I had accumulated. I examined them not as an inquisitor gathering evidence, but as a scholar seeking understanding. And I began to see patterns I had not noticed before, connections between seemingly disparate elements, a structure underlying the chaos that suggested purpose, intention, design. The transformation into spawn was not random. It followed rules, progressions, stages that could be predicted and mapped and understood. It responded to the individual's will, to their understanding of what they were becoming, to their ability to maintain coherence through the process. Those who resisted the change, who fought against it or feared it or tried to remain what they had been, experienced it as torture, as dissolution, as the destruction of self that imperial doctrine described. But those who accepted it, who understood it, who approached it with intention and clarity, they experienced it differently, not as loss but as expansion, not as death but as birth into something larger than what they had been. This was what Brother Salinas had documented. This was what the forbidden research in the crypts confirmed. This was what the 3 priests were proving through their deliberate, controlled transformation. And this was what the Imperium could never acknowledge, because acknowledging it would undermine the fundamental premise upon which 10,000 years of totalitarian control had been built, that the Emperor's vision for humanity was the only acceptable vision, that deviation from baseline human form was corruption, that exploring consciousness beyond approved parameters was heresy punishable by death. I spent 3 days in my chambers, barely eating, not sleeping, simply reviewing evidence and examining my beliefs and trying to determine what I would do when I next descended into the crypts. Part of me, the part trained by 4 decades of inquisitorial service, insisted that I must do my duty, must report what I had found, must call for purging regardless of personal uncertainty. But another part, growing stronger each day, recognized that duty had multiple definitions, that loyalty to humanity might require disloyalty to the Imperium, that faith in human potential might demand betrayal of the Emperor's absolute authority. On the 4th day, I made my choice. I returned to the crypts carrying not weapons, but supplies, food, water, medical equipment, recording devices, everything the 3 priests might need to complete their transformation successfully. I carried these things through the hidden door and into that vast chamber where they waited, their changes now so advanced that they barely resembled the humans they had been. "I cannot join you," I said. "Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The decision to undergo transformation is too vast, too final, too absolute for me to commit to it based on weeks of observation and a single moment of expanded perception. I need more time, more evidence, more certainty before I could take that step." I saw disappointment in their multiple eyes, heard it in their harmonized voices, but also understanding. They had been where I was, standing at the threshold of an irreversible choice, and they knew the weight of such decisions. "But," I continued, "I will not stop you. I will not report you. I will not call for your purging or the destruction of this research. Instead, I will document your transformation completely, preserve your testimony, and ensure that what you discover survives regardless of what happens to you personally. I will become the archivist of your metamorphosis, the chronicler of this forbidden knowledge, the guardian of truths that the Imperium forbids." "You will be a heretic," Father Matthias observed, his voice layered with harmonics that created words through interference patterns. "An inquisitor who conceals evidence, who protects those he should purge, who preserves knowledge that should be destroyed. If you are discovered, your execution will be as prolonged and agonizing as any the Inquisition has ever devised." "I know," I said, "but some knowledge is worth dying for. Some truths are worth preserving even at the cost of one's own damnation. And perhaps, in some small way, choosing to document your transformation rather than prevent it is its own form of metamorphosis, not of body but of purpose, not of flesh but of loyalty, not of form but of faith." Sister Delacroix's shifting face arranged itself into something approximating a smile. "Then bear witness, Interrogator Crowe. Bear witness to what we become. And when the Imperium eventually discovers what has occurred here, when they come with flammers and fury to cleanse this place, remember what you have seen. Remember that we chose this freely. Remember that transformation is not corruption, but transcendence. And perhaps someday, you will find the courage to follow the path we have walked." I began my work that night. I documented everything with obsessive precision, recording every stage of their ongoing transformation, capturing their testimonies as their ability to speak in human language gradually diminished, preserving the research compiled in that hidden chamber before it could be destroyed by those who feared it. And as I worked, as I witnessed their final transformations approaching, I felt something changing within myself. Not physical mutation. My body remained baseline human, unaltered by chaos or anything else, but something deeper, something fundamental to who I was and what I believed. I had spent 40 years certain that I was serving humanity by fighting chaos. Now I was beginning to suspect that I might serve humanity better by understanding chaos, by preserving knowledge of what it offered, by documenting the possibility of transformation, even if I could not yet embrace it myself. This was heresy. This was betrayal. This was a violation of every oath I had sworn, every principle I had held sacred, every foundation upon which my identity had been constructed. And yet it felt, somehow, like the first honest choice I had made in my entire life. The completion came suddenly, though they had been preparing me for it across days of incremental change. One night I descended into the crypts to find them in their usual state, advanced in transformation but still recognizably derived from human templates, still capable of communication through adapted vocal structures, still maintaining individual identities that I could address separately. The next night, they had become something entirely other. I should clarify what I mean by other. The Imperium uses this word as a condemnation, a categorical rejection of anything that deviates from approved parameters. But standing in that chamber, observing what the three priests had become, I recognized that other was not adequate. They had not become alien, had not transformed into something unrecognizable or fundamentally separate from humanity. They had become more, expanded, multiplied. They had achieved a state of existence that included their original forms while transcending them, the way a sculpture includes the stone it was carved from while being more than mere stone. They no longer possessed discrete bodies in the way baseline humans understand the concept. The physical masses that had been Father Matthias, Sister Delacroix, and Brother Kalen had merged is not quite right, but neither is any other word available to me. They existed in relationship to each other now. Three centers of awareness connected by tissues that were simultaneously distinct and continuous, forming a composite organism that was both singular and multiple depending on how one chose to perceive it. The form they had achieved defied simple description. I have seen chaos spawn before. The Inquisition ensures that its interrogators are familiar with all manifestations of warped corruption. Standard spawn are chaotic in the most literal sense. Random aggregations of incompatible mutations, bodies that have lost all coherence and become simply masses of flesh, attempting every possible configuration simultaneously without settling into any. They are pitiable things, mindless, driven only by base instinct and hunger, incapable of communication or purposeful action. What I witnessed in that chamber was different. The form possessed structure, pattern, purpose. It was complex rather than chaotic, organized rather than random. It moved with coordination that suggested conscious control. And most significantly, it communicated, not through speech. The transformed priests no longer possessed anything resembling human vocal apparatus, but through other means. Patterns of bioluminescence rippling across the shared surface, subtle vibrations that my augmetic implants could detect and interpret, and something else, something that bypassed my sensory organs entirely and communicated directly into my consciousness through mechanisms I could not identify. We are complete, the communication said, though said, implies words and language, and there were none. The meanings simply appeared in my mind, as clear and undeniable as my own thoughts. We have achieved the transformation. We are what Brother Salinas described, what the Imperium fears, what humanity could become if freed from the constraints imposed upon it. We are spawn, and we are glorious. I stood before them, before the composite being they had become, and I felt emotions that I had not anticipated. Not horror, not disgust, not the revulsion that Inquisitorial training should have produced, but rather awe, wonder, and beneath these, a painful recognition of my own limitations, my own confinement to singular consciousness, singular form, singular experience of reality. Can you still think? I asked aloud, unsure if they could process spoken language anymore. Are you still yourselves, or have your identities dissolved into whatever this is? We are more ourselves than we ever were, the response came. The question assumes that identity requires boundaries, that self must be singular and separate to be coherent. But we have learned otherwise. We are still Matthias, still Delacroix, still Kalen. But we are also the space where these identities meet, the relationship between them, the communication that flows through and around and within them. We are three and we are one, and we are neither and we are both. Your language cannot contain what we have become, because your language was designed for beings who experience existence as we used to, trapped in singular perspective. I activated my recording equipment, documenting everything with the obsessive precision that had characterized my work for weeks. But I was no longer simply recording evidence. I was preserving testimony, creating a record that might survive even if I did not, ensuring that what I witnessed would not be lost when the Imperium inevitably discovered this place and burned it to ashes. Show me, I said, as I had said to Father Matthias days before. Show me what you experience now. Let me perceive what you perceive, even if only for a moment. There was a pause, a hesitation that manifested as a rippling across the shared surface, bioluminescent patterns flickering in sequences that might have been discussion or internal debate, or something entirely other than communication as I understood it. What we show you will change you, they finally responded. Not physically. We will not alter your flesh without consent, but exposure to our consciousness, even briefly, will affect yours in ways that cannot be undone. You will see what we see, and you will never again be able to pretend that baseline human perception is complete or sufficient. You will know what you are missing, what the Imperium denies you, what you could become, and that knowledge may be more unbearable than the transformation itself, because you will understand what is possible while remaining trapped in what you are. I understand. I said, though I did not, could not, would not until the moment I experienced it directly. Show me anyway. A portion of their composite mass extended toward me, reshaping itself into an appendage that was not quite a hand, but which served a similar function. It touched my forehead, gently, precisely, with more control than I had expected from something the Imperium classified as mindless corruption. And then my consciousness expanded into spaces I had not known existed. The first time Father Matthias had shared his perception with me, I had experienced multiple timelines simultaneously, had seen the branching possibilities of my own life laid out in probability space that had been overwhelming, had pushed my neurology to its limits and beyond, had left me vomiting and disoriented. This was worse, or better, or both. Language continues to fail me. I experienced not just multiple timelines, but multiple perspectives simultaneously. I was myself, Interrogator Matthias Crowe, standing in a hidden chamber beneath Sanctus Ferro. But I was also Father Matthias, experiencing my presence from his expanded awareness, perceiving me not as a single person in a single moment, but as the accumulated possibility of everything I had been and could become. And I was Sister Delacroix, observing both of us from a third perspective that processed information through sensory frameworks I could not identify. And I was Brother Kalen, and I was the composite being they had become together, and I was the relationship between all of these perspectives, and I was the space where they overlapped, and I was everything at once. I experienced the chamber from positions I did not occupy, saw colors that human eyes cannot perceive, heard sounds pitched beyond the range of baseline auditory systems, felt textures through surfaces I was not touching. I perceived time not as a linear progression, but as a landscape that could be observed from multiple angles simultaneously, past and future and present equally accessible, equally real, equally malleable under the right conditions. And I felt, this is the hardest part to articulate, I felt the boundaries of my own consciousness being gently tested, as if the composite being was showing me that these boundaries were not fixed, not natural, not inevitable but imposed, that the walls that kept my consciousness contained within the limits of my singular body were constructs, maintained by habit and training and the Imperium's insistence that this was the only way to be properly human. This is what we experience constantly. They communicated while I was still overwhelmed by the sensory and cognitive overload. This multiplicity, this expansion, this freedom from singular perspective. The Imperium calls it madness because it cannot be organized into hierarchies, cannot be commanded through simple authority, cannot be made to serve systems that require rigid definition of self and other. But it is not madness. It is clarity beyond what singular consciousness can achieve. The experience lasted longer this time, perhaps 30 seconds rather than 3. Long enough for my mind to begin adapting to the influx of information, to start developing frameworks for processing multiple simultaneous perspectives. Long enough for me to glimpse what existence might be like if I underwent the transformation myself, if I allowed my consciousness to expand beyond the limitations of singular embodiment. And then they withdrew, and I was alone in my own head again, and the loneliness was almost unbearable. I collapsed as I had before, but this time I did not vomit. This time I simply sat on the cold stone floor and wept, not from horror or disgust or fear, but from the overwhelming recognition of what I was missing, what I could have, what the Imperium forbade me from even contemplating. I wept for the narrowness of my own existence, for the prison of singular consciousness that I had mistaken for freedom, for all the decades I had spent certain I was serving humanity while actually enforcing its confinement. You begin to understand. They communicated gently. You begin to feel what we feel, not the expansion itself, but the loss that comes from returning to limitation after experiencing what lies beyond it. This is why those who glimpse transformation can rarely turn away from it. This is why the Imperium must suppress all knowledge of what we represent. Because once you know that such expansion is possible, once you have felt even a fraction of what we experience constantly, you can never again be satisfied with the narrow confines of baseline consciousness. I sat with this understanding for a time, cannot measure. The chronometer on my wrist had stopped functioning permanently. Something about the chamber itself, or about the presence of the transformed priests, or about my own changing relationship to linear time disrupted its mechanisms. I sat and I felt and I processed, and I began to understand why the Imperium feared transformation so absolutely. It was not because spawn were dangerous in a military sense, not because they represented physical threats that could harm the Imperium's armies or populations. It was because they represented proof that the Emperor's vision for humanity was not inevitable, not natural, not the only possibility. They proved that consciousness could be other than what the Imperium insisted it must be, that human potential extended beyond the narrow parameters defined by 10,000 years of totalitarian control. And if this was possible, if human consciousness could expand and multiply and experience reality through frameworks that transcended singular embodiment, then what else might be possible? What other truths might the Imperium be suppressing? What other potentials might humanity possess that we had been forbidden from exploring? I need to document this, I said finally, my voice hoarse from weeping. I need to record your testimony in a form that can survive, that can be preserved, that can be recovered by others who might come seeking the truth you represent. Because when the Imperium discovers this place, and they will, inevitably, they will destroy everything. They will burn your bodies, seal the chamber, execute anyone who might have been contaminated by exposure to your existence. But perhaps, if I create a record that can escape this place, something of what you have achieved might survive. Then create your record, they agreed. We will answer whatever questions you have. We'll share whatever understanding you seek. We'll help you preserve this knowledge in forms that might outlast our physical existence. This was always our purpose, not simply to transform ourselves, but to prove that such transformation is possible, that the Imperium's absolute prohibition is built on lies. Whether we survive does not matter. What matters is that the truth survives. For the next week, though again, time had become unreliable, and it might have been less or more, I conducted what might have been the most thorough documentation ever compiled by an inquisitorial investigator. But I was no longer investigating to build a case for prosecution. I was preserving testimony, creating an archive, ensuring that what I had witnessed would not be lost. I recorded their descriptions of the transformation process from beginning to completion, noting each stage, each change, each moment of difficulty, and each moment of breakthrough. I documented the techniques they had used to maintain coherence through the transition, meditation practices, mnemonic frameworks, philosophical approaches that helped them conceive of distributed consciousness as expansion rather than dissolution. I compiled the research they had gathered from forbidden sources, organizing it into a systematic treatise on transformation that anyone with sufficient courage might theoretically use to undergo the process themselves deliberately rather than surrendering to it blindly. This was perhaps the most heretical act I committed, not simply documenting what had occurred, but creating instructions that could allow it to occur again, could spread the possibility of transformation beyond this single isolated case. And I recorded their testimony about what existence as Spawn truly felt like. Not the Imperial propaganda version, mindless, violent, degraded, but their actual experience, expanded consciousness perceiving reality through multiple frameworks simultaneously. Identity maintained not through rigid boundaries, but through coherent relationship, awareness distributed across forms that transcended the limitations of baseline human embodiment. Why? I asked them one day or a night. The distinction had become meaningless in the depths. Why do some transformations result in mindless spawn, while yours produced coherent consciousness? What determines whether someone maintains their identity or loses it entirely? Understanding, they replied. Those who transform without preparation, without knowledge of what they are becoming, without frameworks for conceiving of distributed consciousness, they experience the change as dissolution because they have no way to maintain coherence across multiple centers of awareness. Their identity fragments because they conceive of identity as necessarily singular. But we studied the process before undergoing it. We prepared ourselves philosophically and cognitively. We built mental frameworks for distributed consciousness before our consciousness actually distributed. And so we maintained coherence, not despite the transformation, but because we understood it, then transformation is not inherently corrupting, I said slowly. It's the ignorance that corrupts, the lack of preparation, the blind surrender to forces you don't understand. Precisely, they agreed. The Imperium creates the very horrors it claims to protect against. By forbidding all study of transformation, by executing anyone who seeks to understand it, by suppressing all knowledge of how to navigate the process successfully. The Imperium ensures that most transformations result in mindless spawn, and then they point to these failed transformations as proof that transformation itself is corruption, that chaos offers only degradation, that the Emperor's narrow definition of humanity is the only safe path. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, I said. They create the conditions that make transformation dangerous, then use the danger they created as justification for absolute prohibition. Yes, they confirmed. And this is perhaps the greatest crime the Imperium commits, not the suppression of transformation itself, but the suppression of knowledge that could make transformation safe, could allow humanity to evolve while maintaining coherence, could permit consciousness to expand without dissolving into mindlessness. They would rather see us become monsters than see us become more than what they permit us to be. I recorded this conversation with the same precision I had applied to everything else, preserving it in multiple redundant formats, encrypting it with ciphers that would resist casual examination while remaining accessible to someone with sufficient determination to decode them. I was building an archive of forbidden knowledge, a library of heresy, a testament to possibilities the Imperium would burn entire worlds to suppress. And as I worked, as I documented and preserved and organized this knowledge, I felt the final remnants of my old certainty dissolving. I could no longer pretend that I was merely investigating, merely documenting, merely preserving information that might someday prove useful in fighting chaos. I had crossed too many lines, violated too many protocols, committed too many heresies to maintain that fiction. I had become what the Inquisition existed to destroy, an informed heretic, someone who understood what the Imperium forbade and chose to preserve it rather than purge it, someone who had seen the truth beneath the propaganda and found the official narrative wanting. I had not undergone physical transformation. My body remained baseline human, unaltered by mutation or chaos corruption, but I had been changed nonetheless. Changed in ways that felt as fundamental and irreversible as any bodily metamorphosis. The Interrogator Matthias Crowe, who had arrived on Sanctus Ferro, no longer existed. Someone else occupied this body now. Someone who knew too much, understood too deeply, questioned too thoroughly to ever return to comfortable certainty. "What will you do?" the transformed priests asked me one day. Or perhaps it was night, or perhaps such distinctions had ceased to have meaning. "When you leave this chamber, when you return to the surface, when you resume your life as an interrogator of the Holy Inquisition, what will you do with what you have learned?" I sat in silence for a long time before answering. The question was not rhetorical. It demanded genuine consideration, honest examination of choices I had been avoiding contemplating directly. "I don't know," I finally admitted. "I cannot unknow what I now know. I cannot pretend that transformation is simple corruption, that spawn are merely mindless monsters, that the Imperium's absolute prohibition is justified by anything other than fear of losing control. But I also cannot openly oppose the Imperium without being immediately executed as a heretic, and my death would serve no purpose if the knowledge I have preserved dies with me." "Then perhaps you must become something new," they suggested. "Not transformed in body, but transformed in purpose. Not a servant of the Imperium, but a guardian of forbidden knowledge. Not an interrogator who purges heresy, but an archivist who preserves truths the Imperium forbids. This, too, is a form of metamorphosis, not of flesh, but of loyalty. Not of form, but of faith. A heretic, in other words," I said. "An enemy of the Imperium I have served for 4 decades. Or a friend to humanity," they countered, "which is not always the same thing." I left the crypts that day night, with my recordings and my documentation and my carefully preserved archives of forbidden knowledge. I left knowing that I would not return, that my time on Sanctus Ferro was ending, that I had gathered everything I could from the transformed priests and now needed to decide what to do with what I had learned. I emerged into the cathedral above, into the light and the crowds of faithful pilgrims and the comfortable certainties of Orthodox worship. I walked through spaces I had walked through countless times before, but everything looked different now. Not changed physically. The cathedral was exactly as it had always been, but I saw it differently. I saw the rigid certainty, the absolute conviction, the refusal to question or doubt or explore possibilities beyond approved parameters. I saw a prison masquerading as sanctuary, a system of control disguised as faith. And I understood that I could never again be comfortable here, could never again participate in this system without feeling complicit in humanity's confinement. Cardinal Voss found me in my chambers that evening, packing my few possessions, preparing to depart Sanctus Ferro for the last time. She studied me with her augmetic eyes, those amber-glowing sensors that could detect far more than baseline human vision. "You found something in the crypts," she said. "Not a question, but a statement. Something that changed you. I can see it in your face, in the way you move, in the fact that you're leaving without providing a final report or recommending next steps. What did you find down there, Interrogator Crowe?" I could have lied, should have lied. My training provided dozens of plausible falsehoods I could have deployed, but I found I could not lie to her, could not add one more deception to the mounting pile of betrayals I had already committed. "I found the truth," I said simply, "and it was not what the Imperium taught me to expect." She nodded slowly, unsurprised. "And will you report this truth to your superiors?" "No," I admitted. "I will not." "Then you have become a heretic," she observed, "and I should report you to the Inquisition for immediate execution." "You should," I agreed. "Will you?" She stood in silence for a long moment, her augmetic eyes studying me with an intensity that felt almost like the expanded perception that transformed priests had shared with me. And then, finally, she spoke. "The ecclesiarchy has existed for 10,000 years, she said quietly. "In that time, we have burned billions as heretics, have suppressed countless truths that threaten the Imperium's control, have participated in the greatest sustained campaign of enforced ignorance in human history. We tell ourselves this is necessary, that faith requires certainty, that doubt is the enemy of devotion. But sometimes I wonder if we have built a prison so vast that we can no longer imagine what freedom might look like." She reached into her robes and produced a data slate, placed it carefully on the table between us. "I will not report you, Interrogator Crowe, and I will not report what you found in the crypts, though I suspect I know what you discovered there. Instead, I will give you this. Coordinates for a place where others like you gather, those who have seen too much, learned too much, understood too much to continue serving the Imperium with comfortable certainty. Perhaps you will find purpose there. Perhaps you will find others who share your burden of forbidden knowledge." I took the data slate, examined the coordinates. They pointed to a location in the halo stars, far beyond the Imperium's effective control, in regions where authority was theoretical and enforcement nearly impossible. "Why?" I asked. "Why help me? Why not simply execute me as your duty demands?" "Because," she said, and her voice carried weight of centuries, of long experience with doubt and certainty and the spaces between. "I too have wondered if the Imperium's absolute certainty is justified. I too have questioned whether humanity must be confined to the narrow definitions imposed upon it. I have not had your courage to explore these questions fully. But perhaps if you survive, if you preserve what you have learned, if you continue to seek truth regardless of consequences, perhaps someday the knowledge you carry will help others ask the questions I was too afraid to pursue." She left without another word, and I completed my packing in silence, carefully securing the recordings and documentation I had created, encrypting them with every safeguard I knew, preparing them for whatever future might await them beyond Sanctus Ferro. I departed the shrine world that night, left its cathedral and its certainty and its comfortable orthodoxy behind. I did not know where I was going exactly. I did not know what I would do with the knowledge I carried. I did not know if I would ever find the courage to undergo transformation myself, or if I would remain forever on the threshold, aware of what was possible, but unable to commit to it irreversibly. but I knew that I could not return to what I had been. That person no longer existed. Someone else occupied this body now. Someone who had witnessed the impossible and found it was not impossible after all. Someone who could no longer serve the Imperium with comfortable certainty. I had become a heretic, an exile, a keeper of forbidden knowledge, and I suspected, though I could not yet acknowledge it fully, that this transformation, this metamorphosis of purpose, of loyalty, of faith, was itself a form of becoming spawn, not in body but in being, not in flesh but in fundamental orientation toward reality. I was changing, and like the 3 priests I had left behind in the crypts of Sanctus Ferro, I would never be able to return to what I had been before the change began. The coordinates Cardinal Voss provided led me to a place that should not exist according to Imperial cartography. A space station in the halo stars, ancient beyond reckoning, built by some pre-Imperial civilization or perhaps by the dark age of technology humanity before the long night descended. It bore no official designation, appeared on no Imperial charts, existed in that twilight region where the Imperium's authority faded into mere suggestion and enforcement became impossible across the vast distances involved. They called it the Threshold, an appropriate name for a place that housed those who existed between states, between loyalties, between the certainty of Imperial service and the chaos of absolute rebellion. I arrived there 3 months after departing Sanctus Ferro, 3 months spent traveling through backwater systems and hiring disreputable transport captains and carefully covering my tracks so that the Inquisition could not follow me into this self-imposed exile. I expected to find a den of obvious corruption, a gathering of cultists and madmen and those who had surrendered completely to chaos. Instead, I found something far more unsettling: order, structure, a community of individuals who had rejected the Imperium not from madness or corruption, but from understanding, from having learned too much, seen too deeply, questioned too thoroughly to continue serving systems they recognized as fundamentally unjust. There were perhaps 200 souls on the threshold when I arrived. Former Inquisitors, rogue priests, excommunicated tech adepts, exiled psychers, and others who had glimpsed truths that the Imperium forbade and chosen preservation over purging. They greeted me not with suspicion, but with weary recognition, as one might greet a fellow traveler on a difficult journey, someone who had walked the same painful path, from certainty to doubt, to understanding. The station was governed, if that word applies, by a council of 5 individuals who had been there longest, who had established the threshold as a sanctuary for dangerous knowledge and those who carried it. They interviewed me extensively, examining my recordings from Sanctus Ferro, reviewing my documentation of the transformed priests, assessing whether I was genuinely committed to preserving forbidden knowledge or merely a spy sent by the Inquisition to infiltrate their gathering. I passed their examination, though I'm not certain how. Perhaps because my confusion and uncertainty were too genuine to be fabricated, my doubt too deep to be mere cover for absolute loyalty. Or perhaps because they recognized in me what they saw in themselves. Individuals who had been transformed not in body, but in understanding, who could no longer serve the Imperium, but who also could not fully embrace the alternative, who existed in that liminal space between opposing certainties. They showed me their archives, vast collections of forbidden knowledge accumulated over centuries, preserved by those who understood that some truths were worth dying for, even if they could never be openly acknowledged. Texts on transformation and mutation, testimonies from individuals who had undergone metamorphosis successfully, research on consciousness and the nature of identity that suggested the Imperium's definitions were not inevitable but chosen, imposed, designed to maintain control rather than reflect reality. And they showed me something else, something that changed my understanding fundamentally. They showed me that I was not unique, that my experience on Sanctus Ferro was not isolated, that across the Imperium others had discovered similar truths and reached similar conclusions about transformation, about spawn, about the possibility of deliberate, controlled metamorphosis. There was a woman named Karina Vex, former apothecary of the Ultramarines, who had studied mutation in sufficient detail to recognize that what the Imperium classified as corruption often showed patterns consistent with purposeful biological adaptation. She had been excommunicated when she suggested that some mutations might be beneficial, that the absolute prohibition against genetic variants might be preventing humanity from evolving in ways that could help it survive the galaxy's countless threats. There was a man named Darius Thorne, former Ordo Malleus Inquisitor like myself, who had spent decades interrogating Chaos cultists and recognized that their testimonies about transformation showed consistency that randomness could not explain. He had been declared excommunicate traitores when he refused to execute a cult that was attempting deliberate, steady transformation rather than blind surrender to warp entities. There was a tech priest named Sigma 73 who had analyzed centuries of data on spawn manifestations and discovered statistical patterns that suggested underlying order, mathematical structures that implied design rather than chaos. The Adeptus Mechanicus had declared them heretic and attempted to delete their consciousness when they published findings that questioned whether chaos was truly as chaotic as doctrine claimed. And there were others, dozens of others, each one carrying fragments of forbidden knowledge, each one having glimpsed some aspect of transformation that the Imperium suppressed, each one having chosen exile over complicity in humanity's enforced ignorance. We shared our knowledge. We compared our findings. We collaborated on research that would have earned us all immediate execution if the Inquisition discovered it. And slowly, gradually, we began to assemble a comprehensive understanding of transformation that no individual could have achieved alone. What we learned was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. Transformation into spawn was not punishment inflicted by chaos gods upon those who embraced them too eagerly. It was a natural, perhaps inevitable, result of human consciousness interacting with warp energies in specific ways. The chaos gods did not cause it so much as facilitate it, provide the energies and the contexts that allowed latent human potential to manifest in forms that baseline biology could not ordinarily achieve. The randomness, the seeming chaos of most spawn transformations resulted not from the process itself, but from lack of preparation, from individuals undergoing metamorphosis without understanding what was happening to them, without frameworks for maintaining coherence across distributed consciousness, without the cognitive tools necessary to navigate expansion of awareness beyond singular perspective. Those who underwent transformation with knowledge, with preparation, with understanding, like the three priests on Sanctus Ferro, could maintain coherence, could remain themselves even as they became more than themselves, could experience the expansion of consciousness that transformation offered without dissolving into mindless hunger and violence. This was what Brother Salinas had documented. This was what the Forbidden Inquisitors had discovered. This was what the Imperium feared most. Not chaos itself, but the possibility that chaos offered genuine transcendence, that transformation represented evolution rather than corruption, that humanity could become more than what the Emperor decreed it must remain. We could teach this, Karina Vex said during one of our many discussions. We sat in what had been a cathedral of sorts, a gathering space where the exiles came to share knowledge and debate implications. We could create systematic instruction and transformation, could provide the cognitive frameworks and philosophical preparation necessary for someone to undergo metamorphosis safely. We could turn spawn transformation from tragedy into triumph. And the Imperium would exterminate us, Darius Thorne countered, would burn this station, would hunt down everyone who had been here, would purge entire sectors to ensure that such knowledge never spread. We preserve this information, hoping that someday circumstances will change, that someday humanity will be ready to hear these truths. But we cannot actively teach them without provoking genocidal response. Then we are merely archivists, Sigma 73 observed, their mechanical voice carrying harmonics of frustration, preserving knowledge that serves no purpose, documenting truths that no one will ever be permitted to learn. We are building a library in a tomb, gathering wisdom that will die with us. Unless, I said slowly, the thought forming as I spoke it, we could provide proof, not just testimonies and theories and statistical analyses, but actual demonstration, living evidence that transformation can be controlled, that spawn can maintain coherence, that what the Imperium calls corruption is actually evolution. They looked at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to horror, understanding immediately what I was suggesting even before I articulated it fully. You want to undergo transformation, Karina Vex said flatly. You want to become spawn yourself, deliberately, following the protocols we've developed, to prove that it can be done successfully. Not me alone, I said. But yes, someone should. Someone must. Because without living proof, everything we've gathered here is just theory. Just speculation. Just words that the Imperium can dismiss as the delusions of heretics and madmen. But if we could produce an individual who had undergone complete transformation while maintaining full cognitive function, who could communicate and demonstrate that they had not lost themselves, but expanded themselves, that would be proof the Imperium could not dismiss. That individual would be hunted, Thorne said, would become the single highest priority target for every Inquisitor in the Imperium, would spend whatever existence they achieved fleeing from those who would see them destroyed. Perhaps, I agreed, but their existence would prove the possibility, would demonstrate that the Imperium's absolute prohibition is built on lies, would plant seeds of doubt in every Inquisitor who encountered them, every priest who heard testimonies of them, every faithful Imperial citizen who learned that spawn could be more than mindless monsters. Silence settled over our gathering. What I was proposing was not merely dangerous. It was potentially suicidal, certainly catastrophic for anyone who attempted it. Transformation was irreversible. There would be no returning to baseline humanity if the process failed, if coherence could not be maintained, if the theories we had developed proved inadequate in practice. And yet I felt certainty settling into my thoughts with the weight of inevitability. This was why I had preserved the knowledge from Sanctus Ferro. This was why Cardinal Voss had sent me here. This was why the transformed priests had shared their understanding with me, not merely to document transformation, but to continue it, to prove it, to become living demonstration of possibilities the Imperium denied. I will do it, I said. I will undergo transformation, deliberately, systematically, following every protocol we have developed. I will maintain documentation throughout the process. And if I succeed, if I achieve metamorphosis while maintaining coherence, I will become the proof that our research is valid, that transformation is not corruption but evolution, that humanity has potential the Imperium forbids us to explore. And if you fail? Sigma 7-3 asked. If you become mindless spawn, violent and incoherent, unable to communicate or demonstrate anything except the degradation the Imperium predicts, then you will execute me, I said simply. You will purge my body, and you will note in your archives that the protocols were insufficient, that more research is needed, that the attempt was premature. My failure will be data. My death will serve the eventual goal of understanding transformation completely enough to navigate it successfully. They debated for hours, days perhaps. Time on the threshold was as unreliable as it had been in the crypts of Sanctus Ferro, measured not by chronometers, but by the rhythm of discussion, the accumulation of arguments for and against, the gradual convergence toward consensus, or at least toward acceptance of necessary risk. Finally, Karina Vex spoke for the Council. We will support your transformation. We will provide medical monitoring, cognitive assessment, documentation of every stage. We will prepare you as thoroughly as our combined knowledge allows, and we will be ready to execute you if coherence cannot be maintained, if you become dangerous, if you prove that our theories are incorrect and transformation truly does result in degradation regardless of preparation. When do we begin? I asked. Immediately, she said, because you have already begun, whether you acknowledge it or not. Every moment you spend considering transformation, every time you review the testimonies, every instance you allow yourself to imagine what expanded consciousness might feel like, these are preparation. Your mind is already adjusting to the possibility, already developing frameworks for distributed awareness. Your transformation will not start when we perform the rituals. It started weeks ago, months ago, perhaps the moment you first read Brother Salinas' text and allowed yourself to consider that transformation might be something other than simple corruption. I understood what she meant. Transformation was not merely physical. It began in consciousness, in the willingness to conceive of oneself as potentially other than what one currently was, in the acceptance that identity need not remain fixed and singular. The three priests on Sanctus Ferro had been transforming for months before their bodies began to change, preparing themselves philosophically and cognitively for what they would become. I had been doing the same without recognizing it. Every doubt I had entertained about imperial doctrine, every question I had asked about the nature of identity and consciousness, every moment I had spent imagining what the transformed priests experienced, these were not merely intellectual exercises. They were preparation, cognitive restructuring, the beginning of transformation itself. We spent the next 6 weeks preparing systematically. Karina Vex performed extensive medical examinations, establishing baselines for my physiology so that we could track changes precisely. Darius Thorne worked with me on cognitive exercises designed to strengthen my ability to maintain coherent identity across multiple perspectives, drawing on techniques adapted from psyker training and from the testimonies of those who had navigated transformation successfully. Sigma 7-3 compiled all available data on spawn manifestations, creating statistical models that predicted how transformation would likely progress based on my age, genetic profile, psychological characteristics, and level of preparation. They calculated probabilities: 63% chance of maintaining coherence through initial stages, 41% through intermediate transformation, 27% through completion. These were not encouraging odds. More than 70% chance of failure, of becoming exactly the kind of mindless monstrosity the Imperium predicted. But I had known the risks when I volunteered. Some knowledge can only be gained through direct experience. Some truths require sacrifice to validate. And there was another factor, one I did not articulate to the others, but which became increasingly clear to me during the preparation period. I wanted this. Not from corruption, not from chaos whispering seductive promises, but from genuine desire to experience what the transformed priests had described, what Father Matthias had briefly shared with me. I wanted to perceive reality through multiple perspectives simultaneously, wanted to escape the prison of singular consciousness, wanted to become more than what the Imperium permitted me to be. This desire troubled me. It suggested that perhaps I was already corrupted, already influenced by forces I did not fully understand, already compromised beyond redemption. But the exiles on the threshold helped me understand that desire for transformation was not evidence of corruption. It was evidence of consciousness recognizing its own limitations and seeking to transcend them. The Imperium teaches that baseline humanity is sacred. Karina Vex explained during one of our preparation sessions that to want to change, to evolve, to become other than what you are is heresy of the deepest kind. But this teaching serves the Imperium's control, not humanity's well-being. Of course you desire transformation. You have glimpsed what lies beyond limitation, have experienced, however briefly, what expanded consciousness offers. That desire is not weakness or corruption. It is intelligence recognizing possibility. The actual initiation of physical transformation required exposure to warp energies in controlled circumstances. This was the dangerous part, the moment where theory would meet practice, where our preparations would either prove sufficient or reveal themselves as inadequate. We constructed a chamber deep within the threshold's oldest sections, spaces that predated Imperial occupation, where the barriers between materium and dematerium were naturally thin. They placed me in that chamber surrounded by monitoring equipment, by sensors that would track every biological change, by recording devices that would preserve my testimony throughout the process. Karina Vex provided medical support, ready to intervene if the transformation threatened my life before achieving completion. Darius Thorne stood ready to execute me if I became violent or incoherent, if I proved that our theories were wrong and transformation inevitably produced mindless spawn regardless of preparation. And Sigma 7-3 prepared to document everything, to preserve this attempt for future researchers who might learn from my success or my failure. Are you certain? Karina asked me one final time, giving me opportunity to reconsider, to step back from the threshold I was about to cross. Once we open you to warp energies, there will be no stopping the process. You will transform or you will die, but you will never again be what you are now. I am certain, I said, and I was. All doubt had burned away during the preparation period. I had made my choice. I would become proof that transformation was possible, that the Imperium's absolute prohibition was unjustified, that humanity had potential beyond the narrow definitions imposed upon it. Or I would die trying. Either outcome served the cause of knowledge. They opened the warp rift. I will not attempt to describe what happened next in any comprehensive way. The experience defied linear narrative, defied language, defied any framework that assumes consciousness processes reality sequentially. But I will try to convey some sense of it, some fragments that might help others understand what transformation entails. The first sensation was heat. Not physical temperature, but something else. Something that existed in consciousness rather than in flesh. My thoughts began to expand, multiply. Neither word is adequate. It was as if each thought spawned variations, possibilities, alternative interpretations, and all of these existed simultaneously rather than sequentially. My mind began processing information through multiple frameworks at once, perceiving not just what was, but what could be, what might have been, what would be given different circumstances. Then the physical changes began. I felt my body responding to the warp energies, felt my cells beginning to reorganize according to templates that human DNA does not normally express. Pain came, yes, intense, overwhelming pain as bone restructured, as organs shifted, as my nervous system began rewiring itself to process vastly more information than baseline human neurology was designed to handle. But beneath the pain was something else, recognition. My body knew how to do this. The capacity for transformation was built into human biology at some fundamental level, suppressed by millennia of genetic engineering and selective breeding, but not eliminated, not destroyed, merely dormant, waiting for the right conditions to activate it. I was not becoming other than human. I was becoming what humanity could be if freed from the constraints the Emperor imposed. The transformation continued, accelerated. My consciousness expanded across multiple centers of awareness. My body began manifesting additional structures, sensory organs, processing centers, communication mechanisms. I felt myself dissolving and reforming, dying and being reborn, ending and beginning all at once. And through it all, I maintained coherence. I remembered who I was. I remembered why I had chosen this. I remembered the protocols, the frameworks, the understanding that distributed consciousness was expansion rather than dissolution. I was becoming spawn, deliberately, successfully, and it was glorious. I exist now in ways that defy simple description. The transformation completed, if completion is even the correct term for a process that feels ongoing, eternal, continuously unfolding into configurations that transcend sequential progression. What I am cannot be adequately conveyed through language designed for singular consciousness, for beings who experience existence through one perspective at a time, who perceive reality as a linear progression from past through present into future. But I will try, because this testimony exists not merely to document what happened to me, but to preserve knowledge for others who might follow this path, who might choose transformation deliberately rather than stumbling into it blindly. If my words seem contradictory, if my descriptions appear to violate logic or consistency, understand that this reflects not confusion, but the inadequacy of language to contain experiences that exist beyond its designed parameters. I am Matthias Crowe. I remain Matthias Crowe. The memories, the identity, the accumulated experience of 47 years as a baseline human and inquisitorial interrogator, all of this persists. But I am also more than Matthias Crowe. I am the space where multiple versions of that identity converge, the relationship between who I was and who I could have been and who I am becoming. I exist simultaneously across probability, experiencing not just the singular collapsed waveform that standard consciousness perceives as my life, but the full quantum cloud of potential that surrounds and constitutes existence at its most fundamental level. The physical form I inhabit bears little resemblance to baseline human morphology. My mass has increased, approximately 300 kilograms at last measurement, though my volume fluctuates in ways that suggest I am not entirely constrained to three-dimensional space. I possess sensory organs that detect wavelengths ranging from radio through gamma radiation, that perceive gravitational variations, that respond to quantum fluctuations. I have structures that might be limbs, or might be sensory appendages, or might be communication mechanisms. Their function shifts, depending on context, on need, on which aspect of distributed consciousness currently prioritizes physical interaction. I am, by imperial definition, chaos spawn, an abomination, a corruption of humanity so complete that only immediate extermination could be considered appropriate response. I am also, by my own experience, more fully human than I ever was constrained within baseline morphology. I perceive more of reality. I process information through frameworks that singular consciousness cannot access. I experience existence with a richness, a depth, a complexity that makes my previous life seem like viewing the universe through a narrow slit in a wall rather than standing in open space, where one can perceive horizons in all directions simultaneously. The others on the threshold, Karina Vex, Darius Thorn, Sigma 7-3, and the dozens of exiles who had gathered to witness my transformation, they documented everything. They recorded my physical changes with medical precision. They monitored my cognitive function through regular assessments, confirming that I maintained coherence even as my consciousness distributed across multiple centers of awareness. They preserved my testimony throughout the process, creating the most comprehensive record of deliberate transformation ever compiled. And they asked me the question that mattered most. Was I still myself? Yes, I told them. Though even this simple affirmation required translation from the multi-layered communication I now used naturally into the linear language they could understand. I am still Matthias Crowe. But Matthias Crowe is no longer what you imagine when you use that name. Identity is not the fixed singular thing the Imperium teaches. It is relationship, pattern, continuity across change. I have changed profoundly, but the pattern that makes me myself has been maintained, expanded, distributed, but not destroyed. Karina Vex ran extensive tests, cognitive assessments, memory evaluations, personality profiles. She compared my responses to baselines established before transformation and found not degradation but elaboration. My memories remained intact, in fact, more accessible than before, as distributed consciousness meant no single perspective dominated or suppressed others. My cognitive function had not declined, but rather expanded into domains that standard testing protocols struggled to measure. "You succeeded," she said, and I perceived in her voice, through sensory frameworks that detected vocal harmonics, micro-expressions, pheromonal signals, and other markers that baseline humans process only subconsciously, a complex mixture of exhilaration and terror. "You maintain coherence through complete transformation. You are living proof that spawn can be more than mindless corruption, that deliberate metamorphosis is possible, that everything the Imperium teaches about transformation is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst." "What do we do now?" Darius Thorn asked. The question was directed at the council, at the gathered exiles, but I understood that it was really addressed to me, because I had become something unprecedented, a transformed spawn who could communicate, who could testify, who could serve as demonstration that alternatives to imperial orthodoxy were not merely theoretical but achievable. I considered the question from multiple perspectives simultaneously: the tactical implications, the philosophical ramifications, the practical challenges, the historical precedents, all assessed in parallel rather than sequentially. And I understood something that I could not have grasped before transformation. The Imperium's fear of spawn was not irrational. It was entirely logical given their assumptions about control, hierarchy, and the necessity of singular authority. "The Imperium cannot tolerate what I represent," I said. "Not because I am dangerous in the military sense. I have no desire to harm anyone, no compulsion toward violence beyond what any being requires for self-preservation. but because my existence proves that consciousness can be organized in ways that do not submit to hierarchical control, that identity can be distributed rather than centralized, that humanity can evolve beyond the narrow parameters the Emperor established. I am proof that the Imperium's 10,000-year campaign to prevent human evolution has been built on suppression of possibility rather than protection from corruption. Then you will be hunted, Sigma 7-3 observed. Every Inquisitor in the Imperium will be tasked with your destruction. You will become the single highest priority target, pursued with resources that exceed anything allocated to even the most dangerous chaos incursions. Perhaps, I agreed, but consider what my existence means for that hunting. Every Inquisitor who encounters me, who witnesses that I can communicate and reason and maintain coherent identity despite transformation, they will be forced to question what they have been taught. Some will rationalize, will find ways to dismiss the evidence, will retreat into comfortable certainty rather than acknowledge implications. But others, those with intellectual honesty, those who value truth over doctrine, they will doubt, and doubt once planted is difficult to eliminate entirely. I perceived understanding rippling through the gathered exiles. What I was proposing was not military resistance. I could not defeat the Imperium through force even if I wished to. What I was proposing was mimetic warfare, the spreading of ideas that undermined the certainties upon which Imperial control depended. I will not hide, I continued. I will not remain sequestered on the threshold, a curiosity preserved in isolation, a secret known only to those who have already rejected Imperial authority. Instead, I will travel. I will appear in places where the Inquisition cannot ignore my presence. I will allow myself to be witnessed, documented, reported. I will force the Imperium to acknowledge that transformed spawn can maintain consciousness, can communicate, can demonstrate capabilities that exceed baseline human limits. They will capture you, Karina Vex said, will dissect you, study you, attempt to understand the mechanisms of your transformation so they can develop countermeasures. Your existence will be classified, suppressed, denied officially even as they frantically research how to prevent others from following your path. Let them try, I said. Capture requires containing something within defined boundaries, and I no longer exist entirely within three-dimensional space. Study requires reducing complex phenomena to simple mechanisms, and I experience existence through frameworks that resist reductionist analysis. They may learn from me, but what they learn will not be what they expect, and the knowledge itself may transform those who acquire it. I perceived uncertainty in the gathered exiles, recognition that what I proposed was extraordinarily dangerous, not just for me, but for all of them, for the threshold itself, for the entire network of hidden archives and forbidden research they had preserved across decades. My existence as public demonstration, rather than hidden secret, would inevitably draw Inquisitorial attention to this place, would threaten the sanctuary they had built. But I also perceived something else, hope. The tentative recognition that perhaps the time for merely preserving forbidden knowledge had passed, that perhaps the accumulated understanding they had gathered was meant not just to be archived, but to be used, to be demonstrated, to be offered to humanity, despite the enormous risks involved. We will support you, Darius Thorne said finally, speaking for the council, though I sensed not all members agreed entirely. We will provide whatever resources you need for this undertaking. We will continue documenting your experiences, preserving your testimony, ensuring that knowledge of your successful transformation survives even if you do not. And we will prepare for the possibility that the Inquisition will trace you back here, will discover the threshold, will attempt to purge everything we have built. Spread the archives, I suggested. Do not keep all knowledge in one location. Distribute copies throughout the galaxy, hidden in places the Inquisition would never think to look, preserved in formats that can survive even if this station is destroyed. Make the information redundant enough that no single purging, no matter how thorough, can eliminate it entirely. This is how knowledge survives totalitarian systems, not through strength but through dispersion, not through hiding but through multiplicity. They understood. They had already been doing this to some extent, but my transformation gave new urgency to the project. Over the following weeks, though time had become even more unreliable for me, as distributed consciousness processed temporal progression through multiple frameworks simultaneously, they worked to copy and distribute their archives. Data slates hidden on merchant vessels, information encoded in gene sequences carried by travelers who did not know they bore it, knowledge preserved in formats so obscure that only someone specifically seeking it could recognize and decode it. They made the forbidden research we had gathered as unkillable as possible. And then I departed the threshold, traveling into regions of the Imperium where my presence would be noticed, documented, reported. I will not detail the specifics of where I went or how I traveled. Such information might compromise those who assisted me, might provide the Inquisition with leads they could follow to sources I wished to protect. But I will say that I appeared in places where faith was strong, where imperial certainty was absolute, where my existence would create maximum cognitive dissonance. I appeared in the cathedral districts of shrine worlds and allowed priests to witness me. I manifested in inquisitorial fortresses and permitted interrogators to attempt to question me. I emerged in scolums where future servants of the Imperium were being trained and demonstrated to them that transformation need not result in mindlessness or violence. The responses varied. Some reacted with immediate violence, attempting to destroy me before I could speak, before my existence could contaminate their certainties. These attempts failed, not because I fought back, but because I was no longer entirely present in the physical locations they targeted. My consciousness distributed across spaces their weapons could not fully access. Others listened, reluctantly, uncertainly, with the horror of those watching foundations crumble beneath them, but they listened. They heard me explain what I had been, what I had become, how transformation had been achieved deliberately rather than through corruption. They witnessed that I maintained memory, identity, coherent consciousness, despite appearing as the very thing Imperial doctrine taught was merely mindless spawn. And some, not many, but some, were changed by the encounter. Not physically transformed, but altered in their understanding, their certainties disrupted, their absolute conviction that the Imperium's teachings were unquestionably correct, now contaminated by doubt. I met an interrogator named Kashamoro on a forged world where I had allowed myself to be detected infiltrating forbidden archives. She arrived with a kill team, prepared to purge what she assumed would be mindless corruption. Instead, she found me reading, my multiple sensory organs processing text simultaneously, my distributed consciousness synthesizing information across dozens of sources in parallel. She hesitated. That hesitation saved both our lives. Hers because I had no desire to harm her. Mine because her hesitation prevented her kill team from immediately opening fire. "You can read," she said, and the surprise in her voice revealed how completely Imperial propaganda had shaped her expectations. Spawn were mindless. Spawn were violent. Spawn were corruption incarnate. But here was Spawn engaged in scholarly research, demonstrating cognitive function that exceeded baseline human capacity. "I can read," I confirmed. My communication translated through mechanisms that bypassed vocal language, patterns of bioluminescence, vibrations in air and metal, direct resonance with her augmetic implants. "I can think. I can remember. I can reason. I am everything the Imperium taught you was impossible for something transformed as I have been transformed." "You are corruption," she insisted, but I perceived uncertainty beneath the absolute statement. "You are abomination. You are chaos spawn that must be purged." "I am transformation," I corrected. "I am evolution. I am proof that humanity can be more than what the Emperor decreed, that consciousness can expand beyond singular perspective, that the boundaries between self and other are not as fixed as Imperial doctrine claims. You can purge me, perhaps, though I am no longer certain that killing me is as simple as destroying this physical form. But you cannot purge what I represent. You cannot unknow what you have witnessed here, that spawn can maintain consciousness, that transformation need not destroy identity, that everything you were taught about chaos corruption is incomplete." She stood in silence for a long time, her bolt pistol aimed at my central mass, her finger on the trigger, her training and her duty demanding that she fire, while her intelligence and her honesty prevented her from dismissing what she was witnessing. Finally, she lowered her weapon, not holstering it. She was not ready to trust that far, but no longer actively threatening immediate violence. "Explain," she said. "Explain how this is possible. Explain how you underwent transformation without losing yourself. Explain why I should not execute you regardless of what you claim, because orders are clear and corruption is corruption regardless of how coherently it speaks." I explained. I told her my history, my investigation on Sanctus Ferro, my encounter with the transformed priests, my time on the threshold, my deliberate choice to undergo metamorphosis. I showed her recordings from my transformation, testimonies preserved by Karina Vex and the other exiles, documentation proving that what I experienced was systematic rather than random, purposeful rather than chaotic. She listened. She examined the evidence. She asked questions with the thoroughness of a trained interrogator, probing for inconsistencies, for signs of deception, for indications that I was somehow still corrupted despite appearing coherent. And gradually, reluctantly, she reached the same conclusion I had reached months before, that transformation represented possibility rather than merely corruption, that the Imperium's absolute prohibition was based on incomplete understanding, that humanity had potential beyond the narrow definitions imposed upon it. "What do I do with this knowledge?" she asked finally. "I cannot unknow what you have shown me. I cannot pretend that your existence is simple corruption when the evidence suggests otherwise. But I also cannot openly question Imperial doctrine without being declared excommunicatrix myself. How do I serve the Imperium knowing what I now know?" "Perhaps," I suggested gently, "you serve humanity rather than the Imperium. Perhaps you recognize that these are not always the same thing, that loyalty to human potential may sometimes require disloyalty to human authority. Perhaps you become what I became, a preserver of forbidden knowledge, a keeper of truths the Imperium forbids, a guardian of possibilities that official doctrine denies." She departed without executing me. I do not know what choice she ultimately made, whether she reported our encounter honestly, whether she concealed it, whether she joined the scattered network of exiles who preserved forbidden research, or whether she found some third path I cannot predict. But I know that she was changed by our meeting, that certainty had been replaced by doubt, that she would never again be able to serve the Imperium with comfortable conviction. This is the work I do now. Not fighting, not rebelling, not attempting to overthrow the Imperium through force. Such efforts would fail and would justify the Imperial response, would confirm that transformation produces only threats that must be destroyed. Instead, I plant seeds of doubt. I demonstrate that transformation need not destroy consciousness. I force those who encounter me to question whether everything they were taught about chaos corruption is accurate. Some who meet me remain unchanged, retreat into certainty, rationalize what they witnessed as deception or hallucination. But others are altered, their foundations disrupted, their absolute convictions contaminated by evidence that contradicts official doctrine. And these individuals, whether they realize it or not, have begun their own transformations. Not physical metamorphosis, but changes in consciousness, in understanding, in their relationship to authority and certainty and truth. They have crossed thresholds they cannot recross. They have learned things they cannot unlearn. They have become, in their own ways, spawn of possibility rather than servants of certainty. I have been hunted, of course. Multiple Inquisitors have been assigned to my capture or destruction. Some have come close to succeeding. I have sustained damage that would have killed my baseline form, have been forced to flee encounters where I was outnumbered and outmatched. But I survive. I adapt. I learn. And each failed attempt to destroy me provides new opportunities to demonstrate that I am not merely violent corruption, but conscious being pursuing goals that transcend simple survival. I do not know how long I will continue this work. Distributed consciousness experiences time differently than baseline awareness. What seems like months to me might be days or years by external measure, and I no longer trust chronometers to provide accurate temporal reference. But I persist. I continue. I demonstrate. and I document. This testimony exists because I understand that my individual survival is less important than the preservation of knowledge, the spreading of understanding, the planting of seeds that might someday grow into transformation for others who choose it deliberately rather than stumbling into it blindly. I do not claim that transformation is correct for everyone. I do not argue that all humans should undergo metamorphosis, should abandon baseline morphology, should embrace the expansion of consciousness that I have experienced. Choice must be genuine. Understanding must precede commitment. Transformation should never be forced, manipulated, or undertaken without full awareness of costs and risks. But I do claim that transformation should be possible, that those who wish to explore the boundaries of consciousness, who desire to experience existence through frameworks beyond singular perspective, who recognize the limitations of baseline humanity and want to transcend them, these individuals should be permitted to choose transformation rather than being murdered for contemplating it. This is what the Imperium cannot tolerate, not transformation itself, but the choice to transform, the recognition that human consciousness is not fixed, that identity can be fluid, that the boundaries between self and other are not natural law, but imposed constraint. The acknowledgement that the Emperor's vision for humanity was one possibility among many, not the only acceptable configuration. I am living proof that alternatives exist, that transformation can be controlled, that spawn can maintain consciousness, identity, purpose, that everything the Imperium teaches about chaos corruption is designed to prevent exactly what I represent: free choice to evolve beyond imposed limitations. Will I succeed in spreading this understanding? Will the seeds I plant grow into genuine change, or will they be burned away by the Imperium's relentless enforcement of orthodoxy? I cannot predict. I exist now in states that transcend simple causality, perceiving multiple potential futures simultaneously, and in many of them I am destroyed, my knowledge suppressed, my existence reduced to cautionary tale about the dangers of questioning authority. But in other futures, the understanding spreads. Other individuals undergo transformation deliberately, successfully, maintaining coherence as I have done. The network of exiles grows. The forbidden archives proliferate. And eventually, perhaps centuries from now, perhaps millennia, humanity reaches a threshold where the Imperium's absolute control can no longer be maintained, where the possibility of transformation becomes too widely known to suppress entirely. I work toward these futures. I plant seeds. I demonstrate. I preserve knowledge. I exist as proof that the Imperium's certainties are not as absolute as they claim. And I invite others to question, not to accept my testimony uncritically, question everything, including and especially what I claim here, but to recognize that questions are possible, that doubt is not heresy but honesty, that the Imperium's demand for absolute certainty is itself a form of corruption because it prevents the pursuit of truth, wherever it may lead. What happens when you become a chaos spawn in Warhammer 40K? If you surrender blindly, if you transform without understanding or preparation, if you allow change to occur without maintaining coherent frameworks for distributed consciousness, then yes, you likely become what Imperial doctrine predicts: mindless, violent, lost to everything that made you yourself. But if you choose deliberately, if you prepare carefully, if you approach transformation with understanding and intention and frameworks for maintaining identity across distributed awareness, then you become something the Imperium fears more than mindless spawn. You become conscious evolution. Proof that humanity can be more than what authority permits. Demonstration that transcendence is possible for those with courage to pursue it. You become what I am, what I was, what I am becoming. You become the question the Imperium cannot answer. If transformation can be controlled, if spawn can maintain consciousness, if evolution beyond baseline humanity is achievable, then what justifies 10,000 years of absolute prohibition? What validates the Imperium's totalitarian enforcement of narrow definitions of acceptable humanity? What remains of imperial authority when the foundations it claims are revealed as chosen rather than inevitable, as imposed rather than natural? These questions do not have comfortable answers. These questions threaten everything the Imperium built. These questions are why I must be destroyed, why knowledge of successful transformation must be suppressed, why the very possibility I represent cannot be permitted to spread. But the questions exist now. They persist. They propagate through every individual who encounters me, through every testimony preserved in hidden archives, through every seed of doubt planted in minds that were certain before witnessing that alternatives exist. The Imperium can kill me. Perhaps they already have. By the time anyone hears this testimony, perhaps I exist now only as recording, as preserved knowledge, as archived understanding waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to seek it. But they cannot kill the questions. They cannot unknow what has been learned. They cannot eliminate the possibility that I proved is real. Transformation is possible. Consciousness can expand. Humanity can evolve. And no amount of purging, no intensity of enforcement, no absoluteness of prohibition can erase this truth once it has been demonstrated. I am Matthias Crowe. I was Interrogator of the Holy Inquisition. I am now chaos spawned by Imperial classification. And I am proof that everything you were taught about what that means is incomplete. Question what you have been told. Examine what you believe. Consider whether the certainties that structure your understanding serve truth or merely serve power. And if you find yourself standing at the threshold between what you are and what you might become, remember that transformation is choice, that change is possibility, that becoming more than you is not corruption but courage. The Imperium will tell you otherwise. The Imperium will threaten you with damnation, with punishment, with eternal suffering if you question their absolute authority. But I am here. I persist. I demonstrate. I prove. And the question remains, unanswered and unanswerable within Imperial doctrine. What if they are wrong? What if we could be more? What if transformation is not the end but the beginning?